Elena Carter stood at the gate of Terminal 3, her hands gripping the handle of her modest carry-on suitcase. The chaos of the busy New York airport swirled around her, a symphony of flight announcements, rolling luggage, and the distant chatter of travelers eager to find their destinations. But Elena's mind was quiet, set solely on the week ahead. A much-needed trip to Atlanta promised warm family reunions, the embrace of her grandmother's stories, and the comfort of home-cooked meals. It was more than just a break, it was a reclaiming of her peace. A quick glance at her boarding pass told her it was time to step into line. She straightened the collar of her blouse, its sharp navy creases reflecting her professional demeanor. Despite her relaxed smile, the echoes of a grueling work week at the law firm she'd clawed her way into tugged at her posture. She reminded herself this trip wasn't about proving anything, it was about reconnecting with where she came from. A soft buzz at her hip signaled a text. Her best friend, Alicia, had sent a simple, warm message. "Enjoy the flight and breathe a little." Elena smirked, picturing Alicia's exasperated expression, the way she always scrunched her nose when giving advice. A deep breath followed, obedient to her friend's reminder, as she stepped forward to present her pass. The attendant gave her a brief, polite nod and a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes before waving her through. The interior of the plane was a familiar mix of snug seats and subtle perfumes, with an undercurrent of recycled air. She made her way down the narrow aisle, catching snippets of conversation, travel plans, whispered reassurances, a sudden burst of laughter from a young boy clutching a stuffed bear. Row 17, Seat B. She tucked her carry-on into the overhead compartment with an efficient motion, the muscle memory of countless flights kicking in. As she settled into her seat, a ripple of awareness coursed through her. A heavy, shifting presence beside her caught her eye. Paul Hendricks, the name she would learn much later, was already seated at 17A, eyes narrowed, lips pursed in a hard line. His fitted blazer spoke of wealth. The silver watch on his wrist gleamed under the overhead lights. But what stood out was the impatient tapping of his fingers, drumming an erratic beat on the armrest. Elena offered a polite nod as their eyes met, only to be met with a flicker of something cold. He looked at her as if she were an unexpected disruption. Before she could dwell on it, the overhead announcement interrupted. "Ladies and gentlemen, please fasten your seatbelts and ensure all carry-on items are stowed securely." She shifted her gaze to the window, allowing the shudder of the plane rolling back from the gate to wash over her. The wheels beneath her rattled with promise. The prospect of leaving behind late nights and scrutinized court filings for the sound of cicadas and the humid heat of home. But the reprieve was short-lived. A cough to her left made her glance back at Paul. His eyes darted from his phone to her and back again, his expression strained with irritation. Before she could react, he stood abruptly, pushing past her knees without so much as an "excuse me." The sudden intrusion made her flinch, and the tight space amplified the jolt. "Sir, please remain seated until we're in the air," a flight attendant's voice called out, lined with professional calm. Paul grunted, lowering himself back into his seat with a huff that could have been mistaken for an exasperated sigh. Elena felt the tension knot in her stomach. She knew the sound. It was the kind made when someone wanted others to hear their displeasure. But she focused on the seatbelt sign, ignoring the unease that whispered at the edges of her mind. Minutes passed, and the engines roared to life, a deep vibration that surged through the fuselage as the plane picked up speed. Just as Elena settled in for takeoff, Paul shifted in his seat again, this time bumping her arm. The sharp contact stung, startling her. "Excuse me," she muttered, not expecting an apology, but offering the civility she hoped for in return. His eyes met hers with an expression that seemed rehearsed, a blank, steely gaze. "Move your arm," he said, each word bitten off as though even speaking to her was an inconvenience. The venom in his voice was subtle but unmistakable, enough to draw the attention of a few nearby passengers. Elena felt heat rise to her face. She had spent years mastering the art of composure, of being unshakable in boardrooms filled with loud voices, but this was different. Here, there was no court to make her case, No judge to see reason. Just the narrow aisle and indifferent faces. "I'm sorry if I'm in your space," she replied evenly, shifting slightly. Paul's lips curled in a smirk. "You people never learn, do you?" he muttered, his voice just low enough to reach her, and no one else. The words struck with the force of an unexpected blow. Elena's chest tightened, and she swallowed hard. The memories of past confrontations, of glances that spoke louder than insults, rose unbidden. A silence followed, dense and pulsing. The plane leveled out, and the seatbelt sign blinked off, but her hands stayed clenched in her lap. A few rows ahead, a child laughed, a bright sound against the muted tones of adult conversation. Elena focused on it, willing it to anchor her. She caught the eye of a fellow passenger across the aisle, an elderly woman with kind eyes who looked away quickly. The guilt of witnessed discomfort etched in her features. Paul shifted again, this time more deliberately, the hard line of his shoulder pressing against hers. "Learn to keep to yourself," he said under his breath. Elena's jaw tightened. The polite restraint she'd been holding on to so fiercely began to fray at the edges. A voice inside her screamed for her to stand up, to shout back. But the sound of her own heartbeat was louder. The indifference of the flight crew and passengers echoed the silences she'd faced before. It was as if they saw but chose not to engage, fearing the trouble of involvement. Suddenly, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, a lurch that made Elena's stomach drop and the overhead bins rattle. Paul used the opportunity to elbow her arm away from the shared armrest, a move so overt that even the elderly woman across the aisle looked back, frowning. The seatbelt sign flashed back on, and a voice overhead reminded everyone to buckle up. The flight attendant, Rebecca Sanders, approached, her eyes sweeping the cabin without settling. She finally paused by Elena and Paul, sensing the uneasy exchange. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, voice laced with practiced neutrality. Paul answered first, his tone carrying the weight of assumption. "Everything's fine, just a bit tight in here." He didn't look at Rebecca but stared straight ahead, his expression one of mild amusement. Elena opened her mouth, ready to speak, but Rebecca's eyes, cool and indifferent, turned to her briefly before flitting away. "Good. Let's keep it that way," she said, and walked off, her presence as fleeting as her concern. The silence that followed was suffocating. Elena felt the knot in her chest tighten, a familiar blend of frustration and helplessness. But this time, she willed herself to breathe through it. This was not where her story ended. In that moment, as the hum of engines filled the cabin and the cityscape of New York shrank beneath them, Elena decided something. She would no longer be a silent witness to her own discomfort. If the world around her chose indifference, she would learn to be her own advocate. And with that resolve, she sat back, eyes steeled, ready for whatever turbulence would come next. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane settled into its cruising altitude. Outside the window, a tapestry of clouds drifted by, bathed in soft pinks and golds as the setting sun cast its glow. But the beauty of the scene was lost on Elena. She sat upright, every muscle tense, the words of Paul Hendricks still reverberating through her mind. "You people never learn." Each syllable crawled under her skin, burrowing deep into a place where long-buried memories of whispered slurs and passing sneers lived. She inhaled deeply, counting slowly to 5, letting the tightness in her chest dissipate just enough so that she could think. She scanned the rows ahead, where passengers leaned into conversations, oblivious or choosing to be. The elderly woman from across the aisle glanced at her again, a flicker of concern in her eyes, but she looked away as soon as Elena met her gaze. Paul shifted beside her, his elbow nudging hers as he readjusted his seat. The gesture, though seemingly casual, was charged with a silent claim of dominance. He smirked, eyes locking with hers for a brief moment, as if daring her to respond. No more, Elena thought. Years of conditioning, politeness, restraint, measured words, collided with the raw edge of the moment. She had fought too hard in her career and life to be dismissed as if she were an inconvenience. "Is there a problem?" Her voice was steady, each word crystalline. Paul's smirk widened into a grin, his eyes narrowing with a gleam of mock amusement. "I didn't realize I'd said anything out loud," he replied smoothly, loud enough for the rows behind them to catch fragments of the exchange. A few heads turned, curiosity sparking in their eyes. Elena's heart pounded in her ears. She was aware of Rebecca Sanders, the flight attendant, weaving her way back down the aisle, tray balanced in her hands. The attendant's eyes flickered over the pair, but she continued without pause, serving the row behind them. Elena's jaw clenched. The isolation was palpable. Before she could respond, Paul's voice dropped, coated in false civility. "It's best if we just mind our own business, don't you think? No need to disturb everyone else. Mind your own business." The phrase echoed back to her like the faintest whisper of childhood reprimands. It wasn't an unfamiliar refrain. She'd heard it, lived it, whenever her outspokenness had been framed as rebelliousness. Her calm assertiveness mistaken for defiance. Elena's voice sharpened. "Respect works both ways." The suddenness of her reply startled even her. Paul's eyebrows lifted in mock surprise before dropping into a scowl. He leaned closer, his breath tainted with coffee and irritation. "You have no idea who you're talking to, do you?" The words came out in a low, venomous hiss. Elena met his gaze, refusing to look away. "Does it matter?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, the challenge clear in her tone. The passengers around them felt the tremor of tension, their shifting eyes betraying their discomfort. The elderly woman across the aisle stopped pretending to read her magazine and looked on, her fingers tracing the edges of a worn page. A young man 2 rows ahead, headphones dangling around his neck, turned in his seat, his eyes dark with the anticipation of confrontation. The din of the cabin softened as the conflict became a spectacle in its own right. Rebecca's steps faltered as she returned from the rear of the plane, drawn by the collective unease rippling through the rows. "Excuse me," Rebecca said, her voice tight, forced into a semblance of authority. "Is there an issue here?" Her eyes flitted from Elena to Paul and then settled into an uncomfortable neutrality. Paul smiled, a tight-lipped expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Not at all. Just a misunderstanding. Isn't that right?" His voice was silk and nails, the threat in it hidden from everyone except Elena. Elena felt the sting of 1,000 past encounters in the moment, the ones she'd let pass without a word, the times she'd walked away from indignities that built like bricks on her back. But now, with the weight of the cabin's gaze and the sharp burn of Paul's smirk cutting into her resolve, she knew she couldn't let this become another story she'd tell herself with regret. "No," she said, each syllable deliberate. "It's not just a misunderstanding." Rebecca's composure shifted slightly, the hint of impatience creeping into her eyes. "Miss, we're trying to maintain a peaceful flight. If this is a minor dispute, I suggest we all settle in and enjoy the journey." Before Elena could protest, Paul leaned back in his seat, a small victory flickering across his features. The attendant's gaze rested on Elena a moment longer, judgment clear, before she turned and walked back up the aisle. Elena's fists clenched. The frustration was sharp and cutting. She caught the eyes of a teenage girl across the aisle, wide and hesitant. The girl looked as though she wanted to say something, but bit her lip and turned away. Elena exhaled slowly, the realization heavy that the cabin's silence was not an ally, but an accomplice. Then, a voice sliced through the strained quiet, clear and resolute. "Enough of this. She's done nothing wrong." It was the elderly woman, her voice quivering with age but steadfast. The words dropped like pebbles into still water, creating ripples that reached every corner of the cabin. All eyes turned to her, then to Elena and Paul. Paul's face contorted, a brief flash of shock overtaking his features before he smoothed them into indifference. He shifted uncomfortably, the veneer of his confidence slipping for the first time. Rebecca hesitated, stopping mid-stride, torn between maintaining authority and acknowledging the murmurs that had started to build around her. Elena looked at the woman, gratitude washing over her like a wave, renewing her strength. She was no longer alone. In that single brave act of solidarity, the bystander effect began to fracture. More whispers joined the woman's bold declaration, soft agreements punctuated by nods. A man in his 20s leaned over to his friend and whispered, "I saw it too." He was way out of line. The tension crackled, fragile yet undeniable. Paul's jaw worked, as if chewing on unsaid words. He glared at Elena one last time before sitting back, crossing his arms with an exaggerated sigh of irritation. The defiance in his eyes remained, but the energy around him had shifted. He could feel it, even if he refused to acknowledge it. Rebecca took a breath and approached again, this time with a stiffer posture. "We need to ensure this flight remains safe and comfortable for everyone. If there are any further issues, we will involve the authorities upon landing." Elena met her gaze, unflinching. "Understood," she said, the resolve in her voice hinting at more than just compliance. It was a promise, to herself, to those watching, and to Paul, that this moment was not the end. This was just the beginning. The hum of the engines droned on, masking the nervous whispers that buzzed through the cabin. Elena's fingers were stiff from the way she had clenched her hands, her nails leaving crescent-shaped imprints on her palms. The support of the elderly woman across the aisle still echoed in her ears, a lifeline in the sea of indifference she had felt only moments before. Paul shifted in his seat, the tight press of his mouth a sign that the veneer of his confidence was cracking. His eyes darted around, assessing the murmurs and disapproving glances from passengers who were no longer pretending to be uninterested. He had underestimated Elena's resolve, and the unexpected voices of support around her added to his discomfort. Elena exhaled, releasing the tension in her shoulders just enough to draw in a steadier breath. The heat that had risen to her face began to cool, replaced by a cautious sense of empowerment. She glanced across the aisle, catching the eye of the elderly woman who had spoken up. The woman's nod was subtle, but it carried the weight of reassurance. It said, "You're not alone." A sudden movement drew Elena's attention. A young man with dark curly hair, probably in his early 20s, leaned forward from a row behind her. He cleared his throat, drawing a few glances from nearby passengers. "Hey," he said, his voice pitched just above a whisper, but with enough strength to command attention. "We all saw it. He's in the wrong, not you." The ripple of agreement around him was small but undeniable. The tension that had gripped the cabin began to shift, not dissipating but changing its nature. It was no longer a one-sided force pressing down on Elena, but a growing current that began to churn against Paul. Paul's eyes narrowed at the young man, and for a moment it looked as if he might respond. But he hesitated, the weight of scrutiny pressing down on him now. His face flushed, and he turned away, the muscles in his jaw jumping with the effort to contain himself. It was a subtle retreat, but to Elena it felt monumental. Rebecca Sanders, the flight attendant, reappeared at the front of the aisle. Her gaze swept over the rows, more calculating now, measuring the potential storm brewing among the passengers. Her professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing a flicker of uncertainty. The balance of the cabin was shifting, and she was no longer sure where she stood in it. "We appreciate everyone's cooperation in keeping this flight peaceful," she said, a practiced edge returning to her voice. But the passengers' murmurs didn't stop this time, and a few turned to whisper among themselves with expressions ranging from concern to quiet determination. Elena felt something new taking root inside her, a confidence forged not from isolation but from solidarity. It wasn't just the elderly woman or the young man's words, it was the shift in the air itself, the unspoken agreement that had formed among those who were no longer content to watch in silence. As Rebecca walked away, her pace quickened, betraying a trace of nerves. The murmurs grew into a low hum, pressing against the tension like wind before a storm. Paul slouched in his seat, eyes flitting between Elena and the passengers, calculating his next move. But he said nothing. For now, silence was his only defense. The cabin lights dimmed further, casting long, soft shadows across the seats. Elena took a slow breath, letting the warmth of solidarity wash over her. The tightness in her chest loosened, and for the first time since stepping onto the plane, she felt the thrum of hope, delicate but unyielding. The cabin had settled into an uneasy quiet, the earlier tension still simmering just beneath the surface. Elena closed her eyes, allowing the rhythmic vibration of the engines to seep into her bones. A steady reminder that she was moving forward, physically and now, in a way she hadn't anticipated. Emotionally. The flight was set to last another hour, and the restless rustling of passengers mirrored the anticipation that hung in the air. A few more glances passed between those who had witnessed the exchange, some with muted approval, others with reserved interest. But Elena wasn't focused on them anymore. She was focused on the steady thrum of her pulse and the realization that she had stood her ground. Paul shifted beside her, his body radiating an anger that crackled like static. He leaned in just enough for only her to hear, his voice a low, dangerous murmur. "This isn't over, girl. You've made a scene, and I'll make sure people know it." Elena's eyes snapped open. The threat, casual and loaded, stung her, but she met his glare without flinching. The faint sound of a phone camera clicking interrupted the tension, drawing both of their attention to the row behind. The young man who had spoken up earlier was holding his phone, angled just enough for Paul to see that he was recording. Paul's eyes widened momentarily, the shock freezing his features before a deep scowl etched across his face. He shifted back, trying to shield himself from view. "Turn that off!" he snapped, but the command sounded hollow, almost desperate. The young man didn't move, his expression unreadable. "We're all watching," he said simply, his voice clear. A few more passengers leaned into the scene, nodding subtly, a chorus of silent witnesses with phones at the ready. Rebecca's approach was swift this time, her gaze sharp as it flicked between Paul, Elena, and the young man. "Sir, ma'am," she said, voice tense with an edge of authority, "I must ask everyone to put their phones away and comply with flight regulations." The young man lowered his phone slowly, his eyes never leaving Paul's. "Of course," he said, but the implication was clear. They had enough. The silence following Rebecca's command was thick and suffocating. Elena's breath caught in her throat as she glanced from Paul's seething expression to the young man behind her, who had settled back into his seat. Phone clutched tightly but no longer recording. Around them the air buzzed with a collective unease that no one dared to puncture with idle conversation. Rebecca stood in the aisle a moment longer, her fingers curling slightly around the edge of a seat, as if she needed the support. Then, with a stiff nod, she pivoted and walked back to the galley, her retreat watched by dozens of eyes. Elena felt the pressure in her chest ease, if only a little. The young man's recording might not have stopped the tension, but it had transformed the space. No longer was she trapped in an invisible battle. This was now a shared moment, heavy with implications that reached beyond her seat in row 17. Paul shifted beside her, his anger palpable. He muttered something unintelligible, but this time there was no mistaking the tremor in his voice. His eyes darted over the passengers, lingering on the quiet expressions of judgment and the occasional defiant gaze. The power dynamic had shifted, and it gnawed at him. Elena's pulse slowed as a flicker of calm settled over her. She wasn't just enduring now, she was seeing, feeling the undercurrents of a larger change. The thought empowered her, sharpening her focus and erasing the last traces of fear. She caught the eye of the elderly woman across the aisle, who watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety, her wrinkled hand trembling on the armrest. "You don't get to make me the villain," Paul muttered again, but the words were more for himself than for Elena. He glanced at her, the challenge in his eyes now tempered by uncertainty. "You did that all on your own," she replied softly, each word carrying the weight of suppressed exhaustion and newfound strength. At that moment, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've received reports of a disturbance on board. I ask that all passengers remain seated, and any issues will be addressed with the utmost seriousness once we land. Thank you for your cooperation." The message cut through the remaining mutters like a blade. A few passengers exchanged glances, their eyes wide with questions that dared not be spoken aloud. Paul's face darkened as he shifted in his seat, shoulders hunching as if to shield himself from the attention that now pressed in from every side. The captain's words had done more than warn. It had validated that something was indeed wrong, and everyone knew where the fault lay. Elena sat up straighter, feeling the shift as if the air itself had changed. A sense of collective awareness threaded through the cabin, binding the strangers together with an unspoken understanding. The flight attendants huddled at the back, their whispers and hurried glances punctuated by worried expressions. Rebecca glanced over, catching Elena's eye with a look that hovered somewhere between regret and resolve. The final hour of the flight felt like an eternity. Elena stared out the window, the dark blue sky an endless expanse that mirrored the swirling emotions in her chest. Every now and then, a murmur would break out behind her, quickly stifled by the tension that hung heavy in the air. Paul remained silent, the rise and fall of his chest the only movement. Then, just as the plane began its descent, a soft voice broke through the quiet. It was the elderly woman again, speaking to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone to hear. There comes a time when silence is no longer an option. The simple sentence resonated through the rows, and heads turned as though pulled by an invisible thread. The young man behind Elena, the one who had recorded the scene, nodded almost imperceptibly, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The unspoken agreement they shared bolstered Elena. She turned back to the window, the lights of Atlanta glowing in the distance, brighter than ever. The wheels touched down with a jolt, and the cabin erupted in a mix of sighs and murmurs. The seatbelt sign blinked off, but no one moved. Instead, a ripple of anticipation swept through the cabin as a uniformed airport security officer stepped into view at the front of the plane. His eyes scanned the crowd before settling on Elena and Paul. Rebecca approached with a resigned expression, gesturing for them both to remain seated. "Please stay until the rest of the passengers have disembarked," she said, her voice soft but firm. The elderly woman, still seated across the aisle, met Elena's eyes one last time and whispered, "Courage, dear." Passengers filed past, some nodding at Elena in quiet recognition. Others threw quick, judgmental glances at Paul, whose rigid posture betrayed the humiliation settling into his bones. The young man with the phone paused as he passed, offering Elena a subtle thumbs up that brought a smile to her lips for the first time in what felt like forever. As the plane emptied and the noise dwindled, the security officer approached. "Ma'am, sir," he said, his tone measured, "I'm going to need to hear what happened." Elena's heart thudded in her chest as the last passenger disappeared through the exit, leaving the plane silent except for the hum of the engines winding down. Paul shifted beside her, his expression hardening under the scrutiny of the security officer and Rebecca Sanders. The attendant's previous indifference was now cloaked in a thin veil of professionalism, her eyes flitting between Elena and Paul as if unsure who held the greater threat to her career. "Please, let's take this step by step," the officer said, his voice calm but authoritative. "Ma'am, would you mind explaining what happened?" Elena took a deep breath, willing herself to stay composed. "It started when she gestured at Paul, who scowled but said nothing, shoved my arm aside and claimed the shared space. Then he made demeaning, racially charged remarks. I tried to handle it calmly, but he kept pushing." Paul shifted, leaning forward as if ready to pounce on her words. "This is absurd," he snapped, his voice louder than necessary. "I didn't do anything she's accusing me of. It was just a disagreement over space. And these accusations?" he scoffed, throwing a desperate glance at Rebecca, who straightened at the challenge in his voice. Rebecca's lips parted, but the officer silenced her with a raised hand. "Sir, you'll have a chance to speak." "Let her finish," Elena continued, her voice steady but her pulse quickening. "When other passengers noticed and started to support me, he escalated with threats. People have recordings that can confirm this." The officer nodded slowly, turning to Paul. "Sir, your response?" Paul's face flushed with indignation. "She's twisting this. I just wanted some peace on this flight. It's not my fault if people misinterpreted it." A soft sound of disbelief came from the back of the plane. The young man who had recorded the incident now stepped forward, his phone still held tight. "I think you should see this," he said, handing the device to the officer. The officer watched the video in silence, his brow furrowing as Paul's voice echoed back in sharp, undeniable clarity. The sound of Paul's muttered slurs, Elena's calm replies, and the murmurs of support from other passengers all played out in the tense space. When the video ended, the officer met Paul's eyes, the weight of judgment clear. "We'll need both of you to come with us to the airport security office for further statements," he said, the authority in his tone leaving no room for protest. Paul stiffened, but he remained silent, the fight draining from his eyes as he realized the battle had shifted beyond his control. The walk through the terminal felt surreal. Elena kept her eyes ahead, ignoring the curious glances and hushed conversations that swirled in their wake. Airport security guided them through a maze of sterile hallways until they reached a plain room with a table, chairs, and a bright overhead light that seemed to spotlight their exhaustion. The young man who had recorded the video, whose name was revealed to be Sam Patel, sat with Elena while Paul and Rebecca took their places across from them. The officers sat at the head of the table, flanked by another uniformed security member who scribbled notes with swift, efficient strokes. "Thank you for your cooperation," the officer began. "We need clear statements from each of you. This recording will be reviewed alongside witness accounts." He looked at Sam. "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." Sam nodded, a slight smile of encouragement aimed at Elena. She took a breath and launched into her account, painting each moment with clarity. Paul's face hardened with each word, the lines of his mouth deepening as his indignation morphed into resignation. Rebecca's eyes darted back and forth, the expression of controlled discomfort growing more pronounced. When Paul finally spoke, his voice was weaker, the bluster gone. "I'm not a racist," he said, each word a bitter pill he barely swallowed. "This was a misunderstanding. People twist words." Sam's phone replayed its damning evidence, accompanied by the officer's cold stare. "There will be further inquiries," the officer said, turning to Elena. "For now, you're free to go, but we may need you to provide more details as our investigation continues." Elena's breath released in a slow, shuddering exhale. The door swung open, and the sounds of the bustling terminal beyond filled her ears. Stepping out, she felt the weight begin to lift. The days following the flight brought a surge of attention Elena hadn't anticipated. News outlets latched onto the story, headlines splashing phrases like "racist confrontation on flight sparks debate" and "passenger stands up against discrimination." The video Sam had recorded went viral, the number of views climbing past 1 million within hours. Strangers reached out to Elena, some with messages of support, others with their own stories of confronting prejudice. One morning, as she sat at her kitchen table with the sunlight spilling through her window, Elena's phone rang. The name Alicia lit up the screen, her friend's voice bright and relieved when Elena answered. "I saw the news," Alicia said. "I can't believe it happened, but I'm so proud of you for standing up. People need to hear this." The truth settled into Elena's bones. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about those who had been silent, who hadn't had someone to record, to speak up, or to listen. It was about a community she now felt more connected to than ever. Later that day, a representative from an advocacy group reached out, inviting her to share her experience at a public forum. Elena agreed, her voice trembling with the anticipation of standing before an audience not just as a victim, but as a beacon of resilience. The auditorium was larger than she expected, filled with faces of all ages, some familiar, most not. Elena stood at the edge of the stage, palms damp, heart racing. Sam had come to support her, seated in the front row, his thumbs up a reassuring anchor. As she stepped up to the podium, the room hushed. She took a deep breath and began. What happened on that flight was not just an incident. It was a reflection of struggles many of us face every day, silently or in plain view. But what happened after, the support, the voices joining mine, showed me that we are not alone. We don't have to be. The words spilled out, shaped by emotions that had simmered for days. Elena spoke not just of the confrontation, but of the countless times she and others had chosen silence out of exhaustion or fear. The audience responded with nods, murmurs, and the occasional tear. When she finished, a roar of applause filled the room, reverberating in her chest and cementing her resolve. The next week was a whirlwind of interviews and panel discussions. Elena found herself standing shoulder to shoulder with activists and speakers she had long admired. Sam's video had become a rallying point, a tool that organizations use to illustrate the importance of standing up and speaking out. Rebecca Sanders, the flight attendant, issued a public statement acknowledging her failures during the incident and pledging to undergo training on handling conflicts with greater fairness and empathy. Paul's company released a statement distancing itself from his actions, and reports emerged that he would face further scrutiny in his professional life. Elena felt a mix of relief and exhaustion, but as she stood in front of yet another crowd, ready to share her story again, she realized something profound. She had found her voice not in the silence of enduring, but in the roar of breaking it. And now, as she looked into the eyes of others ready to speak, she knew the journey was just beginning. Elena sat in her living room, the morning sun casting warm streaks across the hardwood floor. Her phone buzzed with notifications, each one a small reminder of how much her life had shifted in the past weeks. Headlines like "Flight Passenger Turns Advocate for Change" and "A Story of Courage Inspires Thousands" scrolled by on her screen. Yet, amidst the whirlwind, Elena craved quiet moments like this, spaces where she could simply breathe and remember who she was before her name became a rallying cry. A knock on the door jolted her out of her thoughts. She stood, straightened her blouse, and opened it to find Sam Patel grinning at her, a box of donuts in one hand and a coffee in the other. His eyes, bright with youthful energy, met hers with a sense of camaraderie that had grown between them since the flight. "Thought you could use a pick-me-up," Sam said, stepping inside. He glanced around, taking in the scattered notes and open laptop on her coffee table. "Still preparing for tomorrow?" Elena nodded, sinking into the couch as Sam sat opposite her. Tomorrow was the biggest event yet, a national panel on civil rights and community action. The thought made her chest tighten, but seeing Sam's unwavering support calmed her. "Yeah, but this one feels different," she admitted, staring at the bold heading on her laptop. "Justice through action. Stories that inspire change. It's not just telling my story anymore. It's about encouraging others to tell theirs." Sam placed the coffee on the table and leaned back, an easy smile playing at his lips. "You're ready, Elena. You've already done the hard part by stepping up when it mattered most. Now, you're giving others the courage to do the same." The sincerity in his words resonated. She thought back to the messages she had received. Hundreds of stories from strangers recounting their own struggles with injustice. Voices that had remained unheard until now. Elena wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for them. The auditorium was alive with anticipation. Elena stood backstage, listening to the hum of the crowd. The panel was a gathering of advocates, leaders, and everyday people whose voices had sparked change. The stage was set with chairs and microphones, illuminated by bright lights that cut through the dim room. Rebecca Sanders, the flight attendant, was also present, sitting among the panelists. After the incident and her public statement, she had reached out to Elena with a heartfelt letter of apology. They had met for coffee once, a conversation full of stilted words and tentative admissions. Rebecca's presence here now felt symbolic, a reminder that people could change, that bridges could be rebuilt. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Elena Carter," the moderator announced, and the applause washed over her like a wave. She stepped onto the stage, heart pounding, scanning the crowd until she found Sam's familiar face, a steady anchor in the sea of strangers. Elena took her seat, the microphone cool in her hand. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice strong despite the flutter of nerves. "What happened to me on that flight wasn't unique. It was just one of countless moments that people experience every day, moments that are often silenced. But we're here to break that silence." The room held its breath as she continued, recounting the events of that day not as a tale of victimhood, but as a story of collective strength. She highlighted the power of witnesses like Sam, the elderly woman who spoke up, and even those who had sent her messages of support afterward. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably as Elena spoke, her expression both pensive and resolute. When it was her turn, she stood, her voice soft but unwavering. "I was a part of that silence," Rebecca admitted, "and I've learned that silence can be just as harmful as words." The audience absorbed the moment, a mixture of respect and contemplation evident in their faces. Elena watched the shift, noting the way empathy rippled outward, connecting them all in shared understanding. After the panel, attendees flooded the room, their conversations a hum of hope and connection. People lined up to speak with Elena, some with tears in their eyes, others with determined expressions. An elderly man in a tweed jacket approached her, his hands trembling as he took hers. "My granddaughter showed me your story," he said, his voice cracking. "She's been struggling with her own battles at school, facing things I thought were long behind us. You gave her hope, and I wanted to thank you for that." Elena's eyes welled with tears, the weight of his words settling deep in her heart. "Thank you for sharing that with me," she whispered. Moments like these reminded her that every conversation mattered, that every voice raised made a difference. Rebecca lingered nearby, watching the interactions with a mix of admiration and reflection. When the room began to thin, she stepped forward. "Elena," she said, a tremor in her voice, "I wanted to thank you again for allowing me to be here, for listening when I apologized." Elena nodded, a small smile breaking through. "It's not easy to admit when we're wrong," she said, "but change starts with acknowledging the past." Sam joined them, his presence warm and familiar. "Hey, I just heard someone call you a modern Rosa Parks," he said with a teasing grin. "No pressure or anything." Elena laughed, the sound bright and full of relief. The three stood together, bound by an experience that had once been painful, but had since evolved into something greater, a testament to growth, resilience, and the enduring power of solidarity. As the night came to a close and Elena walked out into the cool, clear evening, she looked up at the stars scattered across the sky. Each light was a reminder of the voices she'd heard and those still waiting to be spoken. She knew the journey was far from over, but surrounded by allies, she was ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed the panel were a blur of speaking engagements, interviews, and community gatherings. Elena felt like she was living two lives, the private one she had carefully maintained for years, and this new public life, propelled by a momentum she could no longer control. Yet, each time she stepped onto a stage or in front of a camera, she was reminded why she was doing it. One afternoon, as she prepared for a local radio interview, an email notification popped up on her phone. The subject line read, "Invitation to speak at the National Civil Rights Conference." Her pulse quickened as she opened the email and scanned the contents. It was an invitation to join prominent activists, leaders, and public figures for a national conversation on civil rights and community action. "Big news?" Sam's voice pulled her from the screen. He had shown up to the radio station to support her, as he often did. She turned to him, a smile spreading across her face. "Very big. I've been invited to speak at the National Civil Rights Conference." Sam's eyes lit up. "Elena, that's amazing. This is huge." She nodded, the weight of the opportunity sinking in. It was more than just another platform. It was a chance to reach people on a scale she hadn't imagined possible. Elena sat at her desk later that evening, surrounded by papers and notes. The invitation to speak at the conference had stirred something deep inside her. Memories of growing up, facing subtle and overt prejudices, and the lessons from her parents all flooded back. Her mother's voice came to her mind, steady and resolute. "Elena, strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's the quiet decision to keep standing when the world tries to knock you down." She was still lost in thought when her phone buzzed. The screen flashed with a number she didn't recognize. Answering hesitantly, she was met with a familiar voice. "Elena? It's Rebecca Sanders." Elena's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "Rebecca? Hi. I won't take much of your time," Rebecca said, her voice softer than usual. "I just wanted you to know that since the panel, I've been volunteering with an organization that teaches conflict de-escalation and anti-bias training. I couldn't keep quiet anymore. And that's because of you. Elena's chest tightened with an unexpected wave of emotion. I'm glad to hear that, Rebecca. It means a lot. There was a pause, the silence heavy with shared understanding. Thank you, Elena, for giving people like me a chance to change. After hanging up, Elena sat in silence for a moment, letting the conversation settle. It reminded her that change didn't happen in leaps. It happened in the small, steady steps people took every day. And sometimes, the most unexpected voices could carry the greatest lessons. The day of the National Civil Rights Conference arrived with clear skies and a brisk wind that made Elena's hair whip around her face as she walked toward the grand entrance of the conference hall. The building was adorned with banners bearing messages of unity and resilience. Inside, the energy was palpable, a buzz of conversation and anticipation. Elena's heart thumped as she took her place on the stage. Surrounded by activists whose names she had known long before, her own became part of the conversation. The room filled to capacity, with hundreds of eyes watching, waiting. Sam was in the front row, his supportive smile as constant as ever. Even Rebecca was there, seated beside community leaders she had recently started working with. Elena took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their collective hope and expectations settle on her shoulders. She stepped up to the microphone. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice steady. "It's an honor to be here, to stand before so many who have dedicated their lives to the pursuit of justice and equality. But today, I want to talk about something we all share. Moments when silence feels easier, when it feels safer, and what it means to break that silence." As she spoke, the room seemed to lean forward, drawn into the story of that pivotal flight. But it wasn't just a retelling, it was an invitation. An invitation for everyone listening to find their courage in the ordinary moments, to be the voice that says enough when others remain quiet. By the time she finished, the silence in the room was profound, not from disinterest, but from understanding. When the applause came, it was thunderous, echoing off the high ceilings and filling every corner. The aftermath of the conference brought new opportunities and challenges. Elena was approached by educational institutions and community leaders to collaborate on workshops aimed at raising awareness about discrimination and fostering inclusive practices. She threw herself into this work, traveling from city to city, speaking to high school students, corporate teams, and grassroots organizations. One afternoon, after a particularly moving session at a community center, Elena sat on a bench outside, the sun warming her face. Sam joined her, handing over a bottle of water. "You know," he said with a teasing tone, "you're not just speaking up now, you're building bridges." Elena laughed, the sound ringing clear in the late afternoon air. "I guess so, but it's not just me anymore, Sam. It's everyone who spoke up on that plane. It's you for recording it, the elderly woman who defended me, and even Rebecca. It's everyone who refuses to stay silent." He nodded, the seriousness of his expression tempered by a smile. "Well, for what it's worth, I think your bridges are strong enough to last." Elena leaned back, feeling the steady pulse of hope that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat. It was the kind of hope that promised not just change, but a future where moments of courage, both big and small, would ripple outward and inspire countless others. Months passed, and Elena's work took on a life of its own. Invitations poured in from organizations around the country. Schools, community groups, and corporate firms all wanted to hear her story and learn how to foster an environment where everyone could speak up against injustice. Each talk she gave, each panel she joined, strengthened her resolve and her network of allies. What had started as a traumatic encounter on a plane had grown into a movement she couldn't have anticipated. One morning, Elena sat at her kitchen table sipping coffee while reviewing her schedule. An email caught her eye. It was from the Global Human Rights Summit, an international event attended by some of the world's most influential figures in social justice and policy. The email was an invitation for Elena to participate as a speaker. Her breath caught as she read it, the magnitude of the opportunity dawning on her. Sam called minutes later, having seen the news online before she could tell him. "Elena! You're going international!" he shouted, his excitement contagious even over the phone. She laughed, the sound bubbling up from a place of deep satisfaction. "I guess I am. It feels surreal." But even as she basked in the news, a familiar thought crept in. This isn't just for me. The summit was a chance to amplify voices that had too often gone unheard, to shine a light on the stories that lived in the shadows of society. With a deep breath, she added a new note to her list. Prepare to make this count. The summit was held in Geneva, Switzerland, a city that seemed to buzz with a blend of old-world charm and modern urgency. Elena stood on a balcony overlooking the Rhone River, the clear blue water reflecting the crisp morning sky. The magnitude of the moment felt heavier than ever before. She had spoken to packed auditoriums and influential panels, but this was global. The hall was filled with leaders, activists, and dignitaries from around the world. Elena's name was announced, and she walked onto the stage, the lights bright and blinding for a moment. Her heart pounded as she gripped the microphone. "Good afternoon," she began, scanning the crowd. "My story began on a flight, but it became more than a single moment of injustice. It became a call to action, a reminder that silence can be as loud as any shout. We have all experienced moments where we choose between the safety of silence and the risk of speaking out." The crowd leaned in as she spoke of resilience, the importance of allyship, and the power of ordinary people standing together. She shared not just her story, but those that had been shared with her. The letters and messages from people inspired by her actions, and the collective courage they had found. The applause that followed was deafening, resonating in her chest like a drumbeat. As she stepped off the stage, a man in a tailored suit approached. His face was familiar from news articles, Dr. Rafael Moreno, an esteemed human rights advocate. "That was powerful, Elena," he said, extending a hand. "We need voices like yours in our global task force on anti-discrimination policies. Would you consider joining us?" Elena's eyes widened, surprise mingling with a sense of purpose. "I would be honored." Joining the task force brought Elena into a world of policymaking and legislative advocacy. She found herself in conference rooms with people who could enact real, lasting change. Each day was a crash course in international law, cultural nuances, and the art of negotiation. One evening, as Elena sifted through documents in her hotel room, a message popped up from Sam. "Proud of you, global warrior. Don't forget to take a break." She chuckled, warmth spreading through her at his relentless support. The work was intense, but it was also transformative. Elena spearheaded initiatives to create training modules for international airlines, ensuring that flight staff were better equipped to handle and de-escalate conflicts. She also proposed policies aimed at holding individuals accountable for discriminatory behavior on flights. Rebecca Sanders reached out one day, now working as a consultant for a diversity training program. "Your work inspired me to keep pushing forward," her email read. Elena's heart swelled with pride at how far they both had come since that tense flight. Months later, Elena found herself back in New York, invited to a high school to speak to a group of students who had followed her journey closely. The gym was filled with expectant faces, some barely able to contain their excitement. As she told her story, she noticed a girl in the front row, her curly hair pulled back in a ponytail, eyes wide and unblinking. When the talk ended, the girl approached, holding a notebook covered in doodles. "Hi, Mrs. Carter. My name is Zoe," she said shyly. "I just wanted to say thank you. I'm biracial, and sometimes I feel like I don't fit anywhere. But when I heard your story, I felt brave enough to talk about what I go through." Elena's throat tightened. She knelt so that she was eye level with Zoe. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Zoe. You're braver than you know, and your voice is just as important as anyone else's." Zoe beamed, a small light of hope sparking in her eyes. Elena stood, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility, but this time it was tempered by the knowledge that change was real, that it started in moments like these, with faces like Zoe's. As she walked out of the school and into the crisp autumn air, Elena felt a deep, unshakable conviction. The fight for justice and equality was far from over, but with every step, every story shared, every person who chose to speak up instead of staying silent. They were building a better world, one voice at a time. Elena's return to New York felt different this time. The city's familiar hum carried a new resonance, echoing the relentless rhythm of her recent work. Her role on the International Task Force had shifted her from activist to policymaker, a transition that had come with sleepless nights and moments of doubt. But it was all worth it. One evening, as she looked out at the skyline from her small apartment, her phone rang. The caller ID read Dr. Rafael Moreno. "Elena, I'm calling with some news." Rafael's voice was warm, but tinged with urgency. "The airline regulations you proposed have been reviewed, and they're going to move forward with them. Training for all international flight staff will become mandatory, starting next year." Elena's breath caught in her throat. For a moment, the weight of her efforts, the countless hours of drafting, editing, and advocating, all culminated in this one sentence. "That's incredible," she said, the emotion thick in her voice. "It's because of your determination," Rafael said. "This is a big step, but there's more work to do. I hope you're ready." The call ended, and Elena sat down, her mind spinning. The realization that something tangible had come from that fraught flight months ago overwhelmed her. But Rafael was right. This was only one victory in a much larger battle. She closed her eyes, allowing herself a moment of gratitude before the resolve settled back in. Elena decided to host a gathering for those who had stood by her during the journey. Friends, colleagues, and new allies filled her modest living space. Sam was there, helping set out trays of food, joking about the newfound fame that had swept Elena into circles of power. "So, world changer, how does it feel to be the catalyst for policy change?" Sam teased, handing her a glass of sparkling water. Elena laughed, the sound rich with relief. "Exhausting," she admitted, "but it feels right." Rebecca Sanders arrived soon after, a tentative smile on her face. The room quieted slightly when she walked in, but Sam greeted her warmly, and Elena crossed the room to hug her. "I wouldn't have come this far without you stepping forward, Rebecca," Elena said, holding her gaze. Rebecca's eyes shimmered with emotion. "You gave me the chance to turn a mistake into a lesson. I'm grateful for that." Conversations flowed easily throughout the evening. Stories were shared, and laughter rang out as the group celebrated progress and camaraderie. Elena felt a profound sense of unity in the room. This was what they had fought for, not just policies or change on paper, but real human connection and understanding. In the months that followed, Elena's efforts expanded beyond airlines. She collaborated with advocacy groups to create workshops focused on empowering individuals to confront injustice in their own lives and communities. Each session she led felt like a bridge to the future, where courage was a collective force rather than an individual burden. One workshop, held in a community center filled with young activists, left a lasting impact. A young man named Jamal, with an unwavering gaze and a voice that commanded attention, stood up during a Kwanda session. "Ms. Carter, what do you do when people in power refuse to listen? When silence feels forced on you?" Jamal's question hung in the air, resonating with the struggles she knew so many in the room had faced. Elena looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "You find others who will listen. You build alliances, no matter how small, and keep pushing forward. Every voice joined to yours makes it harder for them to ignore you. And remember, moments of resistance add up." The room filled with nods and murmurs of agreement. Jamal smiled, and Elena knew he understood that while change could be slow, persistence was powerful. Late one evening, Elena sat in her apartment, flipping through pages of her journal. Each entry captured moments of doubt, triumph, exhaustion, and hope. A knock at the door startled her, and she stood to find Sam on the other side, holding a scrapbook. "I thought you might want to see this," he said, stepping inside. They sat together as he opened the book, revealing a collection of articles, photos from events, and handwritten notes from people who had reached out to Elena. A photo from the panel where Rebecca had spoken was placed next to a picture of Elena addressing the United Nations Task Force on Anti-Discrimination Policies. Sam's voice was soft as he turned the page to a snapshot of Zoe, the young girl who had shared her story after Elena's high school visit. "You're changing lives, Elena." She traced the photo with her finger, memories of that moment flooding back. "Not just me, it's everyone who decides to speak up." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her journey both sobering and inspiring. The path ahead was still full of challenges, but it was also lined with allies, voices, and hearts that had been changed. Elena knew that her story was no longer just her own. It was a testament to the power of resilience, solidarity, and the belief that speaking up was worth the risk. As she looked out at the city, the lights glittering like stars, she felt a deep, steady peace. The fight for justice was long, but with each step, each connection, and each voice amplified, they were moving toward a world where silence could never again claim victory. Elena's work continued to spread beyond New York, becoming a catalyst for grassroots movements across the United States. Community centers, schools, and organizations implemented workshops based on the modules she had helped create. The workshops encouraged participants not only to recognize and challenge injustice, but to become active allies. One morning, as Elena sifted through a stack of letters, one in particular caught her eye. It was from a small town in Alabama. The letter was handwritten, each word carefully crafted by a young student named Kayla Johnson. "Dear Ms. Carter, I wanted to tell you that I saw your story on TV, and it gave me courage. Last week, I stood up for a friend when she was being bullied at school. It was scary, but I remembered what you said about speaking up, even when you're scared. Thank you for helping me find my voice. With hope, Kayla." Elena felt tears sting her eyes. Each new message was a reminder that her story was no longer confined to that single flight or even the stages she had spoken on. It had become a movement carried by countless others, like Kayla, who were inspired to stand up in their own lives. She reached for her phone and texted Sam. "Just got the most amazing letter. We're making a difference." His reply came almost immediately. "One voice at a time, Elena. Keep going." A month later, Elena received an unexpected invitation to Washington, D.C. to meet with members of Congress who were interested in crafting legislation aimed at reducing discrimination in public spaces, including transportation. The meeting was scheduled in a grand room adorned with portraits of leaders who had shaped history. Rafael Moreno stood at the front, flanked by several senators and policy advisors. Elena took her place at the large mahogany table, the polished surface reflecting the room's grandeur. "Elena Carter," a senator began, his tone both formal and welcoming, "your story has galvanized action across the country. We want to hear your thoughts on how to ensure these changes are implemented effectively." She took a breath, steadying the rush of nerves. "It's not just about writing laws," she said, her voice confident. "It's about changing the culture around how we respond to injustice. That starts with training, accountability, and empowering people to speak out when they see something wrong." The room listened intently as she spoke, their expressions ranging from serious to inspired. This wasn't just a conversation, it was the foundation for change that could impact millions. After her trip to D.C., Elena decided to visit Atlanta, her hometown, for the first time in months. The familiar streets were alive with memories, playing hopscotch with friends, Sunday afternoons with her grandmother, and the small corner cafe where she'd spent hours dreaming about the future. She stopped by her parents' house, where the porch swing still creaked softly in the breeze. Her mother, now gray-haired but as vibrant as ever, welcomed her with a warm embrace. "I've been watching you on TV, Elena," her mother said, eyes twinkling with pride. "You're doing what we always hoped you would, helping people find their strength." They sat on the porch, talking into the late afternoon, the air filled with the scent of magnolias. It was a reminder of where she came from and why she had started this journey in the first place. Not long after her return, Elena was informed that she had been nominated for the Human Rights Advocate of the Year award, an honor that recognized individuals who had made significant contributions to social justice and equality. The ceremony was held in New York City, under chandeliers that cast glittering reflections on the polished floor of the grand ballroom. Sam accompanied her, dressed in a sharp suit that made him look both proud and slightly uncomfortable. "I'm not sure what's more nerve-wracking, watching you give a speech or sitting here hoping you win," he joked, squeezing her hand for reassurance. When her name was announced as the recipient, the room erupted into applause. Elena stood, heart pounding, and walked to the stage. The lights were bright, but this time they felt warm, like the glow of recognition shared by everyone who had been part of her journey. She took the microphone, scanning the crowd. "This isn't just my award," she began. "It belongs to every voice that has spoken up for change, every person who has chosen courage over comfort. Let this remind us that we're all capable of making a difference, one act at a time." The applause was thunderous, the sound wrapping around her like a comforting embrace. In that moment, Elena knew that her story would continue to ripple outward, inspiring others long after she stepped off that stage. The following day, Elena woke to a morning full of possibility. Her inbox was filled with requests from organizations around the world, from NGOs in Europe to advocacy groups in South America, all wanting her insight on creating programs and policies to fight discrimination. As she sat with her coffee, a new email from Raphael appeared. "Elena, we're assembling a task force to draft a global anti-discrimination charter. Your leadership has been requested." Elena felt her heart swell. The work was growing beyond what she had imagined, becoming part of something that transcended borders and cultures. She texted Sam, "Looks like I'm going global again. Up for another adventure?" His reply came back with a smile emoji and the words, "Always." "Let's keep building those bridges." Elena looked out at the city, the streets bustling with life and possibility. The path forward was full of challenges, but it was also rich with hope. She had learned that speaking up was not just an act. It was a commitment to the future, a vow to keep moving forward, and a promise to all those who dared to stand up that they would never be alone. With renewed determination, she rose to start planning for this next chapter. Because she knew that as long as there were stories to tell and voices to lift, her journey, and the journey of countless others, was far from over. Elena's schedule became a whirlwind of planning meetings and strategy sessions as she prepared for her new role on the Global Task Force. The task of drafting a global anti-discrimination charter was daunting, involving policy advisors, international lawyers, and representatives from dozens of countries. Yet, each meeting filled her with a renewed sense of purpose. Late one evening, as she sat surrounded by stacks of research and policy papers, her phone buzzed. It was a video call from Sam. His face appeared on the screen, lit by the glow of his own laptop. "I thought I'd check in before you get swallowed by paperwork," he teased, a familiar grin breaking the intensity of her day. Elena chuckled. "Too late, but it's worth it. This could set a precedent for generations." Sam nodded, his expression softening. "Remember to breathe, Elena. You're not doing this alone." The reminder was simple but powerful. She took a deep breath, feeling the exhaustion of the day slip away as she realized that Sam, Raphael, and countless others were alongside her in this fight. This was bigger than her. It was a collective effort that had taken on a life of its own. The day of the first assembly arrived. Delegates from around the world filled a grand conference room in Geneva, their conversations creating a buzz that thrummed in the air like electricity. Elena, dressed in a sleek dark blue suit, took her seat at the head table next to Raphael and other key figures. Raphael leaned over, his voice a low rumble. "You ready for this?" Elena met his eyes, the nerves coiling in her stomach. "As ready as I'll ever be." The room quieted as Raphael stood and introduced the task force's mission. When Elena's name was called, she rose and stepped to the podium, the weight of hundreds of eyes settling on her. "Today, we begin not just by discussing policy, but by redefining what justice and equality mean on a global scale," she said, her voice steady. "Our work here is to ensure that when people speak out against discrimination, they are supported by laws that don't just exist, but are enforced." The assembly responded with a collective nod, the energy palpable. This wasn't just a meeting, it was the birth of something transformative. The following weeks tested Elena's patience and resolve. Negotiations with delegates from countries where discrimination laws were weak or unenforced were fraught with tension. Cultural differences sometimes clashed with the unified vision the task force hoped to create. Yet, amidst the challenges, alliances formed. One afternoon, Elena sat in a breakout session with a delegation from East Asia. Their lead representative, Dr. Li Wen, a respected human rights scholar, raised his hand. "Ms. Carter," Dr. Li began, "what you are proposing is ambitious. But ambition without understanding can breed resistance. How do you intend to address that?" Elena paused, choosing her words carefully. "Dr. Li, I believe that change is rooted in listening as much as it is in action. We need to hear the stories, experiences, and perspectives that shape how people view discrimination. By understanding that, we can craft policies that respect cultural nuances while ensuring universal rights." Dr. Li's eyes crinkled at the corners, a small smile appearing. "Wise answer? We may have much to discuss, but I believe this is the right path." One evening, after another marathon day of meetings, Elena received an email from Jamal, the young activist she had met at a workshop months before. His words were simple but powerful. "I see what you're doing. Keep going. You're showing us what's possible." The message hit her in the quiet of her hotel room, a reminder of the real reason she was there. It wasn't just about policy, it was about people. People like Jamal, Kayla, Zoe, and countless others who needed a voice. The next day, Elena presented a revised proposal to the task force that focused not only on punitive measures, but also on education and community-led support systems. The proposal was met with more agreement than she expected, a sign that her message was resonating. Drafting the Anti-Discrimination Charter was a laborious task that took months of back-and-forth edits, debates, and revisions. Every word was scrutinized to ensure that it represented a global commitment to justice. Elena often found herself in deep discussions late at night with Raphael and other key drafters, their eyes tired but determined. Finally, the first draft of the charter was complete. It outlined clear definitions of discrimination, protocols for reporting and addressing violations, and requirements for education and training across various sectors. The draft emphasized the importance of protecting not just individuals, but entire communities that were often marginalized or ignored. The final draft was set for a vote. Delegates filed into the large chamber, their expressions a mix of anticipation and skepticism. Elena sat at the front, fingers laced tightly as she watched the proceedings unfold. One by one, representatives took the microphone, some with words of support, others with cautious endorsements contingent on further dialogue. When the time came for the final vote, the chamber held its breath. Raphael stood beside Elena as the results were announced. The charter had passed with an overwhelming majority. The room erupted in applause, and Elena felt tears prick her eyes. The sound was a symphony of relief, hope, and triumph. She turned to Raphael, who simply nodded, understanding the depth of her emotion without a word. News of the new global anti-discrimination charter spread quickly. Media outlets from around the world reported on the milestone, and Elena found herself on interviews, speaking about the importance of continued vigilance and action. The charter was more than a document. It was a call to countries to adopt meaningful change. Back home, she received letters and messages from community leaders who had followed her journey. Kayla's school in Alabama announced new anti-bullying and inclusion programs, inspired by Elena's work. Jamal's community group shared that they had started monthly meetings to discuss and document local injustices, ensuring they were never overlooked. Despite the victory, the work was far from over. Implementing the charter's guidelines required cooperation and adaptation. Some countries pushed back, citing political and economic concerns. The task force faced criticism from those who believed the charter imposed values that clashed with their national identity. Elena felt the strain of this resistance, but knew that lasting change was never easy. She traveled to countries hesitant to adopt the charter, meeting with leaders, and listening to their concerns. In one particularly difficult meeting, a senior minister from a European nation looked at her with skeptical eyes. "Ms. Carter, your intentions are noble, but we can't overhaul decades of practice overnight," he said. She nodded, choosing her words carefully. "I understand, Minister. Change is a journey, but every journey starts with a single step. The Charter isn't just a set of rules, it's a vision for what's possible." Not every meeting ended with resolutions, but Elena learned to celebrate incremental progress. In some places, small pilot programs were launched, training staff in public institutions to handle discrimination reports with care and urgency. In others, schools implemented inclusion policies that were modeled on the Charter's guidelines. One evening, Elena received a video message from Zoe, the young girl from her school visit. In it, Zoe stood confidently, speaking in front of her classmates about the importance of kindness and standing up for one another. Elena's heart swelled with pride, tears blurring her vision as she replayed the message. As the first anniversary of the Charter's passage approached, Elena reflected on how much had changed since that fateful flight. She had been an individual defending her dignity, and now she was part of a global movement defending the rights of many. The anniversary was marked by events worldwide, celebrating the progress made and acknowledging the work still to come. Elena was invited to speak at a ceremony in Geneva, where it had all begun. Standing at the podium, looking out at a sea of faces from every corner of the world, she took a deep breath. Today we celebrate not just a document, but a commitment. We celebrate the courage it takes to challenge silence, the power of standing together, and the belief that no act of bravery is ever too small. Because it's those small acts joined together that create a force unstoppable. The applause was more than noise. It was an echo of all the voices that had found their strength. Elena stepped back, knowing that her journey would continue. The road was long, but with each step forward, the world grew a little brighter, a little more just. And she would be there, walking alongside it, every step of the way. The year since the Charter's passage had flown by, yet each day had been marked by tireless work and moments of reflection. Elena's days were filled with consultations, meetings, and a growing list of speaking engagements. But as the anniversary of the Charter approached, a wave of nostalgia and pride swept over her. The journey had been long, full of both triumphs and challenges. The anniversary event in Geneva was a grand affair. The conference hall, now familiar to Elena, was adorned with banners and filled with delegates, policymakers, community leaders, and young activists who had been inspired by the work. Sam, who had flown in for the occasion, caught her eye from the crowd, giving her a thumbs up. When it was her turn to speak, Elena walked to the podium, her heart a steady drumbeat. She scanned the room, seeing faces that had become allies and friends over the past year. "A year ago," she began, "we stood here and committed to something bold. A global declaration that discrimination has no place in our world. Today, I see not just progress, but a network of people who have taken those words and turned them into action. Our work has only begun, but the past year has shown us what is possible when we refuse to accept silence." The crowd's applause was resounding, filling the room with a collective sense of purpose. She stepped back, catching Sam's smile, which mirrored her own relief and pride. Despite the celebrations, the second year brought new challenges. The implementation of the Charter required ongoing support and a commitment that stretched beyond the task force. Some nations reported progress, while others lagged behind, their governments citing political unrest and resource shortages. One day, Elena was on a video call with a grassroots organizer from South America named Mariana Cruz, who led a community dedicated to human rights education. Mariana's face, framed by dark curls and a fierce expression, filled the screen. "Elena, we've seen a lot of resistance, but we've also seen people coming together in ways that are new. The Charter has given us a platform to demand more from our leaders," Mariana said. Her voice carried a mixture of determination and fatigue. "We need you to visit, to show them that this fight is bigger than they think." The request resonated with Elena. She had spent the last year primarily in boardrooms and conferences. But now she needed to reconnect with the grassroots movements that had always been the soul of her mission. "I'll come, Mariana," she said, her voice resolute. "Let's show them that this is more than just words on paper." Traveling to Mariana's city was a stark contrast to the polished halls of Geneva and Washington. The streets were bustling, filled with the sound of street vendors, honking cars, and a chorus of voices. Banners with slogans inspired by the Charter hung from buildings, and murals painted by local artists depicted scenes of resilience and unity. Mariana greeted Elena with a tight embrace, her eyes sparkling despite the lines of exhaustion. "Welcome, Elena. This is where the change happens, where the fight is alive." Elena spent days meeting with community leaders, attending workshops where children learned about their rights, and sitting in on discussions where people shared stories of overcoming discrimination. It was both humbling and invigorating. One afternoon, Elena listened to an elderly man recount how, after hearing about the Charter, he had started advocating for fair treatment of workers in the market, where he'd been employed for decades. "I thought change was something only young people believed in," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I see now that it belongs to all of us." The visit culminated in a rally where hundreds gathered in a park, their voices merging into chants of solidarity. Elena stood on the makeshift stage beside Mariana and other local activists, feeling the pulse of the crowd vibrate through the air. "This is the heart of the movement," Elena said into the microphone, her voice clear and strong. "The Charter was just the beginning, but what I see here is its spirit come to life. Change is not handed down, it is built, piece by people like you." The crowd erupted in cheers, and Elena's heart swelled with a mix of pride and hope. She knew there would be more battles ahead, more resistance. But this moment was proof that the seeds planted in policy meetings and debates had taken root in places she had only dreamed of reaching. As the sun set over the city, casting it in a warm golden glow, Elena stood with Mariana and the other leaders, looking out at the sea of faces uplifted with determination. It was clear that this was not the end of her journey. It was only another chapter in a story that would continue to grow, powered by countless voices standing together. The rally in Mariana's city left Elena energized but deeply aware of the work still to be done. As she boarded the plane back to New York, her mind buzzed with the stories she had heard, tales of hardship, defiance, and hope that wove a complex tapestry of resilience. The city she was leaving behind had shown her that change did not rest. It was relentless, moving in the voices of the people who dared to rise. Back in New York, Elena met with Rafael Moreno to discuss the next steps for the task force. His office, lined with books on international law and human rights, felt like a second home. "Elena," Rafael began, leaning forward with a thoughtful expression, "your trip to South America has sparked conversations at the UN. They want to know how we can replicate that kind of grassroots support globally." Elena nodded, her mind already spinning with ideas. "We need to create direct channels between policymakers and community leaders, platforms where their voices are not just heard, but valued." Raphael smiled, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening. "Then let's get to work." The task force launched an initiative called Voices United, a series of forums designed to bridge the gap between policymakers and grassroots movements. These forums were held in cities across continents, connecting activists, local leaders, and government officials. Elena traveled tirelessly, moving from one city to the next: London, Nairobi, Mumbai, meeting with community organizers and sharing the lessons from her journey. In Kenya, she met Amina Kundi, a young activist whose focus was on protecting the rights of women in rural areas. Amina's eyes sparkled with conviction as she described her work. "It's one thing to have laws," Amina said, "but it's another to ensure that those laws are known and followed in the farthest villages. We need awareness as much as we need change." Elena nodded, her admiration for Amina growing. "You're right. And that's why the work you're doing is so important. If people don't know their rights, they can't fight for them." The days were long, filled with meetings and workshops, but each moment reinforced the belief that change had to be built from the ground up. It wasn't just about drafting policies, but creating a living, breathing movement. The Voices United initiative gained momentum, drawing praise and sparking debates in equal measure. The media began to cover Elena's work more intensely, some calling her a hero of modern civil rights, while others critiqued her for pushing too hard, too fast. One evening, after returning to her apartment from a grueling day of interviews and planning sessions, Elena received an unexpected call from Dr. Li Wen, the scholar she had met at the task force assembly. "Elena, Dr. Li's voice was calm but laced with urgency. "I wanted you to know that the work you've been doing has inspired universities in my country to host their own discussions on discrimination and human rights. It's a shift I never thought I'd see in my lifetime." Elena felt a warmth spread through her chest. "That's incredible, Dr. Li. Thank you for telling me. We're only at the beginning," he said, "but I believe this is the turning point." The call left her contemplative, the realization settling in that her efforts were creating ripples in places she had never expected. The task force's work was no longer just her mission. It had become a catalyst for a global movement. And yet she knew this was the moment when the movement could either flourish or falter. The anniversary of the Voices United launch was celebrated with a global summit that brought together young leaders who had been inspired by the Charter and Elena's ongoing advocacy. Held in New York, the summit buzzed with energy. The room was filled with vibrant banners, each representing different regions and the unique ways they had adopted the Charter's principles. Zoe, now a confident high school senior, was invited to speak about how Elena's work had impacted her. Standing at the podium, Zoe's voice rang out clear and powerful. "When I first heard Elena's story, I was just a kid who felt invisible," Zoe said, looking out over the audience. "But now I know that my voice matters. I started a peer support group at my school, and we've been teaching younger students that standing up for each other isn't just brave, it's necessary." Elena, seated in the front row next to Sam and Mariana, felt tears prick her eyes. Seeing Zoe speak so confidently was a testament to what they had all worked for. A future where courage and solidarity were not the exception, but the rule. After the summit, the room buzzed with conversations, the energy electric. Young leaders from different corners of the world shared their stories with each other, exchanging contact information and pledging to keep the momentum alive. Mariana, who had traveled from South America for the event, squeezed Elena's hand. "Look at what you've built," she said, pride and awe in her voice. Elena glanced around the room, taking in the faces of the next generation. "Not just me, Mariana. All of us. This is only the beginning." As the sun set on New York and the summit wound down, Elena felt the powerful hum of collective resolve. The journey had been long, and there were countless battles still to fight. But this room, filled with determined voices and unwavering hearts, was proof that they were on the right path. With a deep breath and a heart full of hope, Elena looked out at the skyline and felt the world shifting, little by little, toward a more just and compassionate future. The fight would continue, but so would the movement, carried forward by every person who refused to let silence win. The momentum from the summit in New York propelled the movement into its next phase. Activists and young leaders from across the globe returned home, invigorated with new ideas and a network of allies who were only an email or call away. Elena, now more than ever, was at the heart of this collective energy. One morning, a message from Kayla Johnson, the young girl from Alabama, appeared in Elena's inbox. The email included a photo of Kayla standing next to a mural she had helped paint at her school. The mural featured a group of diverse figures holding hands beneath the words, "Courage lives here. Dear Ms. Carter, thank you for inspiring me to be brave. Our school is different now, and people talk about things they used to ignore. We painted this mural to remind us every day that speaking up matters. With gratitude, Kayla." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she read. It wasn't just about global summits or high-profile interviews. It was about young people like Kayla, who carried the spirit of the movement into their daily lives, changing their communities from the ground up. That same afternoon, Elena met with Sam at a cafe near her office. The air was warm, the sun casting a golden glow on the busy street outside. "Kayla's growing up in a world that's a little different now," Sam said, after hearing about the email. "And that's because of you." Elena shook her head, smiling. "It's because of everyone who decides to act. I may have started this, but it belongs to all of us now." Sam raised his coffee cup in a silent toast, and Elena clinked hers against it. It was a small gesture, but one filled with promise. As with any movement, progress came with resistance. Certain governments and powerful individuals pushed back against the changes introduced by the Charter, arguing that it infringed on traditional practices or political power structures. The criticism was loud and, at times, discouraging. One particularly tense meeting took place in Brussels, where Elena was invited to defend the Charter at a European Union assembly. The room was imposing, filled with officials who exchanged skeptical glances as she spoke. Elena laid out the successes: increased reporting of discrimination, the education programs being adopted, and the global solidarity that had grown since the Charter's implementation. But a voice from the back interrupted. It belonged to a delegate known for opposing international agreements. "Miss Carter, these changes may work in ideal conditions, but what about places where resources are limited and resistance is strong? Are we to force change where it is unwelcome?" Elena met his gaze, her expression firm but compassionate. "Change isn't easy, and it isn't always welcome," she said, taking a deep breath. "But it is necessary. We are not forcing anything. We are offering a framework that supports justice. It's up to communities to adapt it to their realities. This isn't about imposing, it's about empowering." The room was silent for a moment before murmurs spread through the crowd. Some nodded in understanding, while others scribbled notes, their expressions still cautious. Elena knew it wasn't a clear victory, but it was a start. And in the fight for equality, starts mattered. With the global movement gaining both supporters and critics, Elena continued her work with renewed determination. One evening, after a long day of meetings, she sat by her window, looking out at the city lights. The skyline was alive, bustling with stories she would never know, each window a glimpse into someone's life, someone's struggle, someone's hope. Sam knocked on her door, letting himself in with the familiarity of a best friend who no longer needed to ask. He held up a newspaper, the headline reading, "Voices United, 1 year later." The article praised the global progress made and featured photos of young leaders who had attended the summit, their smiles brimming with confidence. "I thought you might want to see this," Sam said, setting the paper on her coffee table. Elena picked it up, running her fingers over the images. Zoe's face beamed back at her, a testament to how far they had come. "I sometimes wonder what's next," she admitted, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "How do we keep this going when the world keeps pushing back?" Sam leaned against the armrest of her chair, his expression thoughtful. "You keep doing what you've always done, speaking up, lifting others, refusing to back down. And you remind everyone that change isn't just a moment, it's a commitment." The room fell silent as the weight of his words settled between them. Elena knew that the path forward would be difficult, filled with victories and setbacks alike. But it was a path she was willing to walk for as long as it took, because the stakes were too high to stop now. The night sky outside was dotted with stars, each one a reminder of a voice, a story, a life that mattered. And as Elena sat there, with Sam by her side and the city humming with possibility, she felt a renewed strength surge within her. This was only the beginning. The fight for justice, equality, and the courage to speak up was an endless journey, one that she and countless others would continue. And in that moment, she knew, as long as there were voices willing to rise, the movement would live on. Months passed, and the Voices United initiative solidified its place in the global conversation. Forums blossomed not just in major cities, but in remote towns where human rights advocates once struggled to be heard. Elena received updates from allies like Mariana and Amina, detailing local victories that, while small, represented seismic shifts for their communities. One morning, Elena woke to a flurry of messages. A viral video was spreading across social media, an impromptu march in Manila, led by students, chanting for justice and holding banners that read, "We are the change." The video featured young people recounting their experiences of discrimination and asserting their right to dignity. It was raw, unfiltered, and powerful. Tears welled in Elena's eyes as she watched. The movement had transcended borders and become a chorus of voices unified by a shared purpose. The sight strengthened her resolve to push forward, even when the path was unclear. That evening, Rafael Moreno called. His voice was filled with excitement. "Elena, did you see it? The video from Manila?" "I did," she replied, her voice breaking with emotion. "It's incredible. It's everything we hoped this could be." Rafael's tone grew serious. "The world is watching, Elena. The momentum is undeniable, but so is the resistance. We need to stay vigilant and ensure these voices are protected." She nodded, understanding the weight of his words. The march in Manila was a beacon of hope, but also a reminder that the movement's strength needed safeguarding. There were still those who sought to silence it. With visibility came scrutiny. Governments resistant to change ramped up efforts to discredit the Voices United initiative and the Global Anti-Discrimination Charter. Misinformation campaigns spread, claiming that the charter undermined cultural values and sovereignty. Elena's inbox flooded with messages, some from supporters, others filled with accusations and threats. One day, while preparing for a forum in Paris, Elena received an anonymous message warning her to step back. It was vague but threatening enough to make her pause. She shared it with Sam, who was helping organize the event. "Are you worried?" he asked, concern creasing his brow. Elena met his gaze, steady but tired. "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't. But I can't let fear stop me. We've come too far." The event in Paris drew a full house. Security was tighter than usual, but the atmosphere inside was electric. Elena stood at the podium, taking a moment to look at the faces before her. People of different ages, backgrounds, and beliefs, all gathered for the same reason. "I'm not here to tell you that change is easy, or that it doesn't come without risks," she said, her voice resonating with conviction. "But I am here to tell you that it's worth it. Every time we choose to speak up instead of staying silent, we plant seeds for a future where silence isn't the norm." The room erupted in applause, a defiant response to those who tried to suppress them. As the crowd settled, Elena felt a surge of hope. The threats and resistance were real, but they were outmatched by the collective strength in that room and beyond. In the weeks that followed, Elena's schedule grew more intense. The threat against her safety lingered in the background, but she chose not to focus on it. Instead, she threw herself into her work with more determination than ever before. The forums continued to flourish, and stories from Manila, Nairobi, and even smaller towns in Eastern Europe painted a picture of a world beginning to shift. One afternoon, Elena received a letter that caught her breath. It was from Jamal, the young activist she had met at a workshop. His words were heartfelt. "Ms. Carter, I wanted to let you know that because of the charter and your work, my community has started holding our leaders accountable. It hasn't been easy, and there's been pushback, but we're stronger now. People who were afraid to speak up are finding their voices. We owe so much of this to you and what you started. Thank you for being the spark that lit this fire. With respect, Jamal." Reading the letter, Elena felt a deep, unshakable pride. It wasn't just about her work. It was about the countless others who had taken up the mantle, each voice adding to the collective call for justice. That evening she gathered her closest allies, including Sam and Raphael, for a meeting at her office. The room buzzed with conversation as they outlined new plans for expanding their reach. Sam leaned in close and said quietly, "You're changing lives, Elena, and you're showing the world that movements don't just exist. They thrive when they're shared." Elena smiled, the weight of her journey resting lightly on her shoulders for the first time. "We're just getting started, Sam. The movement isn't mine anymore, it's everyone's." As they mapped out new strategies and set their sights on future initiatives, Elena felt a profound sense of renewal. The fight for justice was far from over, but it was no longer a lonely battle. It was a shared journey, woven with the voices of those who refused to back down, who dared to speak up, and who believed that silence would never have the last word. The path forward would be fraught with challenges, but Elena knew one thing for certain. Together, they would continue. They would keep speaking, keep standing, and keep building a world where courage was the norm, not the exception. And in that truth, she found the strength to face whatever came next. Elena's work had spread far beyond what she had ever anticipated. The Voices United forums had sparked satellite movements that now had lives of their own, each echoing the spirit of resilience and defiance that had driven Elena from the beginning. Reports of change flooded in, detailing stories of towns and villages from India to Brazil where people were taking a stand against discrimination. The shift was not just a political one, but a social awakening. One afternoon, while reviewing updates from her international teams, Elena's assistant, Mira, walked in with an envelope bearing an unfamiliar postmark. Mira handed it to Elena with a smile. "This just came in. I thought you'd want to see it right away." Elena opened the envelope and unfolded a letter written in careful, looping script. It was from a teacher in a rural village in Eastern Europe who had incorporated the Anti-Discrimination Charter into her lessons. The teacher wrote about how, for the first time, her students, children of different ethnic backgrounds, felt safe sharing their stories in class. "Your work has reached us, even here," the letter read. "Because of what you've started, my students understand that their voices matter." Elena sat back, overwhelmed by the reach of their work. Every letter, every story was proof that the fight was not in vain. It gave her the motivation to keep pushing, even when resistance was fierce. As the movement expanded, so did the challenges. Misinformation and backlash grew more organized, with detractors accusing the charter of being a form of cultural imperialism. An anonymous article in a prominent international newspaper accused Elena of wielding undue influence and pushing a Western agenda on countries with deep-rooted traditions. Elena knew this was part of the fight, but it stung nonetheless. She convened an emergency meeting with Raphael and other task force leaders to strategize a response. "We need to show that this isn't just one voice speaking for many," Raphael said, his tone firm. "We need more local leaders stepping forward to explain why they support this." Mariana, who had flown in for the meeting, added, "Let's take this as an opportunity to share stories of how communities are adopting the charter in their own ways. Show the world that this movement is about empowerment, not imposition." The plan took shape quickly. Elena and her team reached out to allies across continents, asking them to share their stories publicly. Videos, interviews, and articles featuring local leaders started to circulate, each one emphasizing the unique ways the charter had been adopted and adapted. The coordinated response worked. The voices of those who had embraced the charter rose above the noise, louder and more compelling than the critiques. Elena received a video message from Dr. Li Wen, who had been instrumental in bridging cultural understanding in Asia. In the video, Dr. Li spoke calmly and confidently. "The Anti-Discrimination Charter is not a mandate, it's a mirror. It reflects what we, as societies, need to address. It is up to us to decide what we see in that reflection and how we respond." The video went viral, shared by news outlets and activists alike. It became clear that the charter wasn't an external force, but an invitation for communities to define justice on their own terms. Despite the success, the challenges took their toll on Elena. One evening she sat in her quiet apartment, the noise of the city a dull hum outside. Sam arrived unannounced, as he often did, carrying a bag of takeout and a bottle of wine. "You looked like you could use this," he said, placing the food on the table and pouring them each a glass. Elena smiled, the weariness in her eyes softening. "You always know when to show up." They sat on the floor, plates balanced on their laps, talking and laughing between bites. Sam's presence was a reminder that while the fight was important, so was remembering to live and cherish moments of quiet joy. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Sam asked, breaking a comfortable silence. Elena leaned back, looking up at the ceiling as if the answer were written there. "All the time. But I've learned that the next step reveals itself when it's time. For now, I just want to keep building on what we've started." Elena's impact was undeniable, and recognition continued to follow. One day, she received an invitation that left her stunned. The Nobel Peace Prize Committee wanted to honor her and the Voices United movement with a nomination for their groundbreaking work in fostering global unity against discrimination. The news spread quickly, sparking conversations and debates. Supporters celebrated, seeing it as validation of the work and sacrifices made by Elena and countless others. Critics, however, were vocal, questioning whether a movement that still faced resistance was ready for such an accolade. Elena's phone buzzed with congratulations and requests for interviews. Amidst the noise, one message stood out. It was from Zoe, now preparing for college. "You deserve this. Because of you, I'm not afraid to speak up, and I know so many others feel the same. Thank you, Elena." The message brought tears to Elena's eyes. Winning or losing the award wasn't what mattered. It was knowing that young people like Zoe were unafraid to use their voices. The night of the Nobel Peace Prize ceremony was surreal. Dignitaries, activists, and leaders filled the grand hall, dressed in their finest. Elena, wearing a simple yet elegant gown, felt a mix of pride and humility. Raphael, Sam, and other allies who had been with her from the start sat in the audience, their faces glowing with pride. When her name was announced, a wave of applause filled the hall. She stood and walked to the podium, the lights bright and warm against her face. The speech she had prepared trembled in her hand, but she didn't need it. "This honor isn't mine alone," Elena said, her voice steady and clear. "It belongs to every person who has ever chosen courage over silence, to those who, despite the risks, raise their voices not just for themselves, but for others. This movement is proof that we are stronger together, that unity is not a dream, but a choice we make every day." The applause that followed was a symphony of validation. Elena scanned the room, her eyes meeting those of friends, allies, and strangers who shared the belief that the world could be better and was worth fighting for. In the days after the ceremony, Elena found herself reflecting on the journey that had led her here. From the tense flight that sparked everything to the countless meetings, speeches, and nights spent wondering if any of it would matter. It had all brought her to this moment. Sitting at her desk, the Golden Nobel Medal gleaming beside her, Elena began drafting her next plan, a new initiative aimed at connecting young leaders around the world in a mentorship network. It would be a way to empower the next generation, ensuring that the momentum they'd built continued long after the headlines faded. Sam walked in carrying 2 cups of coffee. "What's next, Global Warrior?" he teased, placing one in front of her. Elena looked up, a smile spreading across her face. "Something big, Sam. Something that ensures the world keeps moving forward." He nodded, clinking his cup against hers. "Here's to that." As the sun set outside her window, casting a warm glow across the room, Elena felt a profound sense of peace. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with new obstacles and victories. But it was a road she was ready to walk, knowing that behind her was a chorus of voices, ready to march with her toward a future where silence would never again be an option. Elena's vision for the mentorship network took shape faster than she anticipated. Emails from educators, community leaders, and young activists flooded her inbox, all eager to participate. The initiative, aptly named Echoes of Courage, would link seasoned advocates with young leaders from various backgrounds, fostering an exchange of ideas, strategies, and support. Mariana called from South America, her voice crackling over the line with excitement. "Elena, this is exactly what we need. Young leaders here are eager but lack the resources and guidance to scale their work. This will change everything." Within weeks, the first round of mentors was selected, including figures like Dr. Li Wen, Amina Kundi, and even Rebecca Sanders, who had pivoted fully into advocacy and training work. Rebecca's involvement symbolized transformation and redemption, showing the participants that change was not just for systems, but for individuals, too. The inaugural Echoes of Courage conference was held online, with participants from more than 50 countries tuning in. The virtual room buzzed with energy as young leaders introduced themselves, sharing stories of small victories and lingering challenges. Elena watched from her office, her heart swelling as Zoe appeared on screen, representing her school's peer support group. Zoe spoke with a confidence that seemed worlds away from the shy girl Elena had met years ago. "It's not just about having a voice," Zoe said. "It's about making sure others do too. And through this network, we can lift each other up." Elena knew then that the seeds they had planted were blossoming into something greater than any one person. Amidst the progress, the relentless pace of Elena's work began to take its toll. Late nights and early mornings became the norm, and the weight of responsibility was ever present. One evening, as she was preparing for another call with international partners, a sharp headache pulsed behind her eyes. She pushed through it, finishing the meeting, but the exhaustion was undeniable. Sam visited the next day, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. "Elena, you need a break," he said, his voice laced with concern. She shook her head, a wry smile crossing her lips. "There's too much to do. If I stop now, who will keep pushing this forward?" Sam sighed, his gaze softening. "You always say this isn't just about you. Trust that others can carry the load too. You've built something that won't fall apart if you rest." The words resonated with her. Elena realized she had been so focused on driving the movement that she had forgotten to take care of herself. That night, she logged off earlier than usual and sat in her living room, the quiet of the space soothing her frayed nerves. The city lights blinked outside, a reminder that life moved in moments, not just milestones. Elena decided to take a short break, visiting her parents in Atlanta. The familiarity of her childhood home, the creak of the porch swing, and the scent of her mother's cooking wrapped around her like a comforting blanket. One afternoon, she sat with her father in the backyard, watching the sun dip below the horizon. He sipped his iced tea thoughtfully before speaking. "You know, Elena, I remember when you were little and stood up to that bully on the playground," he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "You were fearless then, and you're fearless now. But even the bravest warriors need time to breathe." Elena looked at him, the memory bringing a laugh to her lips. "I remember that. I was terrified, but I couldn't let him keep picking on the other kids." Her father's eyes twinkled with pride. "And now, you're doing the same thing on a much bigger playground. Just remember, it's okay to step back and let others stand with you." The visit rejuvenated her, reminding her that the strength of a movement lay not just in its leader, but in its ability to inspire others to take up the fight. Returning to New York, Elena felt revitalized. The Echoes of Courage network was thriving, with young leaders starting their own projects and reaching out to mentor the next wave of advocates. Stories came in from places like Ghana, where a young woman named Nia had launched workshops to educate her community about their rights. Inspired by what she had learned through the network, Nia's story was featured in a major online publication, highlighting the global reach of Elena's work. The article emphasized how the movement had taken root in places where hope had once been scarce. Elena watched the video interview with pride as Nia said, "I'm just one voice, but I know now that my voice can inspire others, just as Elena's story inspired me." Dr. Lee Wen reached out with a proposal for the network to include more educational tools tailored for regions facing severe oppression. His idea was to create a digital library that could be accessed even in remote areas, a project that Elena immediately supported. "Education is the most powerful weapon we have," Elena said in their meeting. "If we can equip people with knowledge, we can empower them to change their circumstances." As the second anniversary of the Voices United Charter approached, Elena and her team planned a global event that would be broadcast live. The event aimed to showcase the progress made and highlight stories from leaders around the world. It would be a night of celebration, resilience, and hope. Elena stood on stage, looking out at the packed auditorium and the cameras broadcasting to millions. Sam, Raphael, Mariana, Dr. Lee, and many other allies were in the front row, their faces a tapestry of support. "2 years ago, we set out to change the world," Elena began. "What we didn't know was how much the world would change us. The movement isn't just alive, it's thriving because of every voice that refused to stay silent. The night was filled with stories. Zoe, now preparing to study human rights in college. Nia, who had brought legal awareness to her village. Kayla, who had grown into a formidable young activist. Each story was a testament to what could happen when people believed in something greater than themselves. As the event concluded with a standing ovation, Elena felt the magnitude of what they had built. The movement was now a chorus, a symphony of voices echoing in every corner of the globe. In the quiet moments after the event, Elena stood outside, the cool air on her face, listening to the city's heartbeat. She knew that the fight for justice was never truly finished, that there would always be new challenges to face. But with a world full of voices ready to rise, she was certain of one thing: the flame they had ignited would never be extinguished. The global event marking the second anniversary of the Voices United Charter had left Elena overwhelmed with gratitude and renewed resolve. The stories shared, the applause that followed, and the messages from viewers around the world all pointed to one undeniable truth. The movement was far bigger than she could have ever imagined. One morning, Elena received a call from Rafael Moreno. His voice was tinged with excitement. "Elena, I have news. The UN has proposed a permanent advisory council on global anti-discrimination policies. They want you to lead it." Elena felt the weight of the offer sink in. This was an opportunity not just to continue advocating, but to shape policies on a global scale. "That's incredible," she said, her voice steady but laced with awe. "It's a chance to solidify everything we've worked for." Raphael chuckled. "And to keep pushing forward, are you ready for that?" Elena smiled, determination sparking in her eyes. "I've never been more ready." The announcement of the new Global Council for Anti-Discrimination Policies brought both applause and criticism. Supporters hailed it as a groundbreaking step forward, while detractors questioned whether it could effectively balance the interests of diverse nations. Elena, now the appointed head, knew that building trust would be as crucial as drafting policies. The council included figures from different regions: Dr. Li Wen, representing East Asia; Amina Kundi, focusing on African initiatives; Mariana Cruz, spearheading South American community efforts; and a respected European lawyer named Isabella Schmidt, known for her fierce advocacy. Their first meeting in Geneva was both intense and hopeful. They sat in a grand room lined with flags, each symbolizing a nation represented. Elena looked at her team, each person embodying resilience and strength, forged through different battles. "We're here because we believe in the same truth," Elena began. "Discrimination isn't confined to borders. It's a global issue that needs global solutions. Let's create a framework that respects cultural nuances but insists on human dignity as a universal right." The room buzzed with agreement, and as they began to outline their agenda, Elena felt a rush of anticipation. The task was immense, but the council was unified. In the months that followed, the council's efforts began to bear fruit. Pilot programs were launched that provided training and resources to marginalized communities. Schools around the world adopted new curriculums that included human rights education, empowering students to recognize and confront injustice. But with progress came renewed opposition. Certain regimes and powerful figures sought to undermine the council's efforts, framing them as meddling in national sovereignty. One particularly vocal critic was a media mogul with influence in both politics and public opinion. Elena's days were filled with debates, public forums, and interviews where she defended the council's mission. "This isn't about imposing foreign values," she argued in one televised discussion. "It's about recognizing that human rights transcend cultural and political boundaries." The interview was met with mixed reactions, with some praising her boldness and others condemning her for overstepping. Yet, amidst the noise, messages of support continued to flow in. Elena knew the battle was far from over, but remained confident in the direction they were heading. One evening, as the sun cast long golden shadows over the city, Elena received a call that caught her off guard. It was from Leandro Ortiz, the influential media mogul who had been one of the council's most outspoken critics. "Elena Carter," His voice was deep, almost detached. "I think it's time we talked." Elena paused, taken aback. "Mr. Ortiz, to what do I owe this call?" "I'd like to meet," he said simply. "There's more to this debate than the public knows. Let's just say I'm willing to listen." The conversation left her uneasy, yet intrigued. She agreed to meet him at a neutral location, a small cafe known for its discretion. The meeting was set for the following week, and the anticipation gnawed at her. What did Ortiz want, and why now? When the day arrived, Elena entered the cafe, spotting Ortiz at a corner table. His presence was formidable, marked by a tailored suit and an air of control. He gestured for her to sit. "I'll be blunt," Ortiz said, leaning forward. "The council's work is admirable but ambitious. There are forces at play that see change as a threat. I'm one of those forces, but I also know when to adapt." Elena's eyes narrowed. "So why now? Why reach out if you oppose what we're doing?" Ortiz's expression shifted, revealing a flicker of something almost vulnerable. "Because opposition without understanding is a fool's game. Your movement has grown beyond control, and even those in power are realizing that they can't ignore it. I'm here to find common ground before the battle lines are drawn too deep." It was a moment Elena hadn't expected, an olive branch from an unlikely source. They talked for hours, not agreeing on everything but finding slivers of shared belief. As she left the cafe, Elena knew that alliances would come from the most unexpected places. This conversation was only the beginning of a more nuanced fight. The next few months were marked by strategic moves and unprecedented partnerships. Ortiz, despite his initial stance, became an advocate for parts of the council's mission that aligned with his interests. His shift in position lent weight to the movement and swayed some of its most vocal critics. Elena felt the tides changing. Policies that once faced resistance were now being debated openly, and more governments expressed willingness to adapt the Charter's principles. Schools in underrepresented areas received funding to implement educational programs, and a renewed focus on workplace discrimination emerged in corporate boardrooms. The Echoes of Courage mentorship network blossomed, with more experienced advocates mentoring young leaders, including those from Ortiz's media company. It was a testament to what could happen when even the most hardened perspectives shifted, however slightly. One evening, Elena stood at her office window, looking out at the city bathed in twilight. Sam walked in, a familiar smile on his face. "You did it," he said, handing her a glass of sparkling water. "You turned critics into allies." Elena took the glass, feeling the cool weight in her hand. "No, we did it," she corrected. "This was never just one person's work." They raised their glasses in a silent toast, the light reflecting off the glass like stars. The road ahead would still be long, marked by setbacks and new battles, but Elena knew they had reached a turning point. The movement was no longer a wave crashing against resistance. It was an unstoppable tide, carrying the world toward a brighter, more just horizon. The future was unwritten, but Elena could see its outlines, formed by voices, bound by courage, and led by a belief that silence would never again be the answer. The breakthrough with Leandro Ortiz marked a pivotal shift in the global perception of the Voices United initiative. The media mogul, once the loudest critic, began to use his platform to broadcast conversations about discrimination, not as a weakness of society, but as a challenge to overcome collectively. Elena knew that real progress came not just from policy, but from changing hearts and minds. And Ortiz's involvement made that possibility more tangible. Elena's days were filled with interviews, discussions, and new collaborations. A standout project involved an international series of town hall-style meetings broadcasted on Ortiz's network. People from different cultures, backgrounds, and professions shared stories of resilience, learning, and moments when speaking up had made all the difference. During one broadcast, Amina Kundi spoke from Nairobi. "The idea that change comes solely from top-down approaches is outdated," she said. "It is conversations, difficult, raw, and honest, that build bridges and create lasting change." The camera panned to Elena, who nodded. That's what this movement has always been about. The courage to start the conversations that others are too afraid to have. The viewership numbers broke records, sparking debates across the globe. Suddenly, the world was not just watching, it was participating. With interest peaking, submissions poured into the Voices United online platform. Stories from factory workers in Bangladesh, students in Spain, and activists in Brazil, these stories were curated into a series called Echoes of Change, a multimedia campaign showcasing voices that had previously been unheard. One story that particularly moved Elena was from Maria, a seamstress in Argentina who had been harassed at work for years. Inspired by the stories she saw in Echoes of Courage, Maria spoke out, rallying her co-workers to demand better working conditions. They succeeded in forming a union, breaking a cycle of silence that had lasted decades. Elena reached out to Maria for an interview. In a shaky but determined voice, Maria said, "Your movement gave us hope. For so long, we thought speaking up would only make things worse. But now we know it can bring change." The stories rippled out, inspiring others to share and act. Governments and companies found themselves having to address issues they'd long ignored. Elena's team worked tirelessly to keep up, ensuring each voice was amplified in a way that empowered more to rise. Despite the overwhelming support, pockets of intense resistance remained. A group of influential business leaders, uncomfortable with the cultural and operational shifts the movement required, funded a campaign aimed at discrediting Elena and her council. Articles and videos questioned her motives, painting her as a figure seeking control rather than justice. The backlash was fierce. Social media filled with both support and criticism, and her inbox overflowed with messages ranging from solidarity to venom. One evening, Sam found Elena at her office, staring at her computer screen with a weary expression. "Hey," he said softly, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Don't let them break your stride." Elena looked up, her eyes reflecting exhaustion, but also defiance. "I knew this would happen eventually. But it's harder when the people you're fighting for are swayed by these lies." Sam met her gaze, unwavering. "Then remind them who you are and why you started this." The next day, Elena posted a heartfelt video addressing the criticism head-on. "I began this journey not for power, but because I refused to let silence be the final word in the face of discrimination," she said, her voice strong and clear. "This movement isn't mine alone. It belongs to every person who has ever felt unseen. And no campaign of lies will change that." The video went viral, reclaiming the narrative. The support came flooding back, bolstered by endorsements from leaders, celebrities, and ordinary people who shared their own stories of why they stood with her. Elena's determination led her to double down on efforts that reinforced community engagement. Echoes of Courage expanded to include not just mentorship, but training programs that taught conflict resolution and effective activism. The Council developed a toolkit for communities facing backlash, providing strategies for maintaining unity and resilience. Dr. Lewin hosted a workshop in East Asia where community leaders learned how to build coalitions to protect their most vulnerable members. Mariana led a project that connected rural leaders in South America with global resources. Even Rebecca Sanders, now a powerful advocate, launched an initiative within the aviation industry that trained flight attendants on handling discrimination with empathy and precision. During a global summit, Zoe, now a university student, stood on stage and spoke eloquently about the importance of youth in the movement. "We are not just the future, we are the present," she said. "The world is changing, and it's up to us to make sure it changes for the better." Elena, watching from the front row, felt a swell of pride. The young girl she once inspired was now inspiring others. The movement had grown roots so deep that even the fiercest storms could not dislodge it. The Council's work culminated in the drafting of a new initiative, the Global Pact for Inclusive Communities. This pact would go beyond anti-discrimination measures, focusing on fostering environments where all voices could contribute to building inclusive societies. Countries that adopted it would commit to public education campaigns, anti-discrimination training in public sectors, and open dialogues between government officials and community leaders. Elena, Sam, Raphael and the rest of the council gathered in Geneva to witness the first signing of the pact by 30 nations. The ceremony was broadcast worldwide, and Elena spoke last, her words chosen carefully. This pact represents not just the fight against discrimination, but the embrace of dignity and unity, she said. It is a promise that we will not only challenge silence, but replace it with voices that matter. As she signed her name, a roar of applause echoed through the hall, followed by a standing ovation. Elena turned to see Sam clapping, tears in his eyes. He mouthed, "You did it." But Elena knew it was not just her victory. It belonged to the council members, to leaders like Zoe, Amina, and Maria, and to every person who had found the courage to stand up and be counted. The event ended with a group photo of the council members, each person representing a different corner of the world, but united in purpose. As the flash went off, Elena felt a profound sense of completion. The road ahead would still be challenging, but it was clearer than ever before. In that moment, standing with her allies, Elena knew the movement would continue, pushed forward by countless voices, built on the promise that silence would never again have the last word. The horizon was full of possibility, and she was ready to walk toward it, surrounded by those who believed in the power of courage and unity. The signing of the Global Pact for Inclusive Communities marked a turning point in the fight for justice and equality. News outlets worldwide covered the event, highlighting the significance of countries coming together to commit to actionable change. The pact, now a beacon of hope, promised more than just words. It outlined a framework for real, transformative progress. Elena returned to New York with renewed energy and an agenda filled with meetings. Calls came in from leaders eager to collaborate and citizens inspired by the pact, wanting to learn how they could be part of the movement. The shift from skepticism to genuine interest was palpable. One evening, as Elena reviewed her plans, Sam joined her with a cup of tea in hand. "You know, I used to think that seeing a moment like this would be enough," he said, taking a seat beside her. "But watching everything unfold, I realize it's not just about witnessing change, it's about being part of it." Elena smiled, resting her head against the back of her chair. "We've created something that will outlast us, Sam. That's what makes all the long nights and battles worth it." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of what they'd achieved wrapping around them like a warm blanket. The weeks that followed saw a surge in community-led initiatives inspired by the pact. Workshops in cities like Johannesburg and São Paulo filled with participants eager to learn about conflict resolution and grassroots activism. Schools incorporated new curriculums that emphasized empathy, diversity, and historical truths, ensuring future generations understood the roots of discrimination and how to combat it. In a heartfelt email, Amina Kundi described how local leaders in Kenya had adopted the pact's framework to address inter-community tensions that had simmered for years. "For the first time, our differences are not seen as barriers, but as strengths," she wrote. "This is what the pact has given us, a reason to come together." Elena shared Amina's story at a council meeting, where other leaders reported similar successes. The pact was no longer just a document. It was a living force that ignited action in unexpected places. One day, Maria, the seamstress from Argentina, sent a video of her community celebrating the one-year anniversary of their union. The group had grown, now including workers from neighboring towns, all banded together by the same belief that silence was no longer an option. Despite the overwhelming progress, challenges remained. Nations that had yet to adopt the pact faced political struggles and resistance from entrenched power structures. Elena knew that while policies could be outlined, the real battle lay in changing mindsets. During a summit in Tokyo, Dr. Lewin hosted a discussion panel addressing the cultural barriers to adopting the pact in more conservative societies. "Understanding and respect must be mutual," he said. "Change must resonate with cultural values while holding firm to the principles of equality." Elena followed his speech, emphasizing the importance of listening. "We don't move forward by shouting over one another," she said. "We progress by opening doors and inviting people in. showing them that what we fight for benefits us all. The summit sparked debates that echoed across Asia, drawing attention to the delicate balance of advocacy and respect for cultural identity. Some critics argued that the pact's principles clashed with national traditions, while others saw it as an opportunity to integrate progressive policies without losing their heritage. Amidst the triumphs and trials, Elena felt a shift within herself. For years, she had pushed relentlessly, driven by a need to ensure the movement's survival. But as she watched new leaders like Zoe step into their own, she realized the time had come to share more of that responsibility. Sam sensed the change before she voiced it. One evening, as they walked through Central Park, the city lights glowing softly behind them, he turned to her. "You're thinking about stepping back a bit, aren't you?" Elena exhaled, the cool air grounding her thoughts. Not stepping back exactly, but stepping aside, making room for others to lead. The movement needs fresh perspectives, new voices that will take it places I can't. Sam smiled knowingly. "And you'll still be there, guiding them." Elena nodded, a sense of peace washing over her. "Yes, I'll always be here." The announcement came during the 3rd anniversary celebration of the Voices United Charter. Elena stood on stage, the familiar hum of anticipation buzzing through the crowd. Leaders from around the world, young and seasoned alike, sat among the audience. "This movement began as a response to silence," Elena said, her voice steady. "But today, it is a chorus that includes every voice willing to speak up for justice and equality. The time has come for me to step into a new role, not as the leading voice, but as a supporter of those who will carry this movement forward." Applause rang out, mingled with gasps and murmurs. Zoe, now an influential youth leader in her own right, rose to speak. "Elena taught us that courage doesn't just exist in grand moments, but in the small daily choices we make to stand up and speak out. We are ready to build on what she started." Elena felt tears prick her eyes as she watched Zoe take her place beside her. This was what they had worked for, a future where the movement thrived without depending on any one person. A future where unity and courage would continue to grow, nurtured by a new generation that understood its value. After the ceremony, as the crowd celebrated and shared stories, Elena stood back and took it all in. The movement, once a fragile hope sparked on a turbulent flight, was now a roaring force that had transformed the world. Sam appeared at her side, a quiet smile on his face. "Looks like you built something unstoppable," he said. Elena reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "We all did, and we'll keep building together." As the night sky above filled with stars, Elena felt the weight of her journey lift, replaced by the lightness of shared purpose. The path ahead was long and winding, but it was filled with voices, fearless, determined, and unyielding. And she knew that as long as those voices kept rising, silence would never win. Elena stood at the window of her new office in Geneva, overlooking the shimmering expanse of Lake Geneva framed by snow-capped mountains. It was a peaceful scene, in stark contrast to the fervor and tumult that had characterized the past few years. The new role she had taken on as an advisor and mentor allowed her to guide and support the next generation, while stepping out of the daily glare of leadership. The Voices United movement had evolved, its reach now spanning regions that had once resisted its message. Policies and programs inspired by the Global Pact for Inclusive Communities had become standard practice in many nations. Schools included lessons on empathy and anti-discrimination in their curriculum, and workplaces had adopted practices that made them more inclusive and aware. An intercom buzzed, pulling Elena from her thoughts. "Ms. Carter, Zoe, and Amina are here to see you," Mira's voice announced cheerfully. "Send them in," Elena replied, a smile spreading across her face. The door opened, and Zoe stepped in first, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail and her eyes bright with excitement. Amina followed, her presence as commanding and warm as ever. They greeted Elena with hugs before settling into the chairs across from her desk. "Guess what?" Zoe began, barely able to contain her excitement. "We just got word that 3 more countries are adopting the full framework of the pact. including educational initiatives and community-based programs. Amina nodded, her eyes reflecting quiet pride. It's more than we hoped for, and it's thanks to the groundwork you laid. But we wanted to discuss something important with you. Elena leaned forward, curiosity piqued. What's on your mind? Amina exchanged a glance with Zoe before speaking. We've been approached by a coalition of youth leaders who want to organize a global youth summit focused solely on actionable steps for creating inclusive communities. They want it to be led by young people, with support from mentors like you. Elena's heart swelled with pride. The vision she had long carried was now expanding beyond her, driven by those she had once mentored. That's incredible, she said. What do you need from me? Zoe's smile was full of determination. Your guidance, of course, and maybe one last speech to kick it off. Elena laughed, the sound rich with joy. I thought I was done with speeches. Amina shook her head, eyes twinkling. Not this one, Elena. You need to show them where it all began and why it matters that they continue. The room fell into a contemplative silence, each of them understanding the significance of the moment. The movement was now a living force, nurtured by thousands of hands, each willing to pass the torch. The weeks that followed were a blur of planning and coordination. Elena watched as Zoe and Amina took charge, rallying support from international organizations, youth groups, and educators. The summit's theme, From Echoes to Action, embodied the essence of the journey they had taken. From a single voice on a plane to a symphony of voices across the world. On the day of the summit, the main hall was packed. Flags from around the world adorned the stage, representing the unity that had grown from a shared commitment to justice. Elena stood backstage, listening as Zoe introduced the event. Her voice was strong, filled with the passion of someone who knew that change was both possible and necessary. And now, Zoe said, her voice carrying a note of reverence, please welcome the person who showed us that one voice can inspire millions. Elena Carter. The applause was thunderous as Elena stepped onto the stage, her heart full. She looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, many new, and felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. These were the leaders, dreamers, and changemakers who would carry the movement forward. Today, she began, her voice steady and warm, we stand on the shoulders of those who dared to speak up, who chose courage over comfort. This movement was never just mine. It belongs to each of you. It is your voices, your actions, that will write the next chapter. As the audience erupted into applause, Elena knew that her role had shifted, but remained vital. She was no longer the lone voice crying out for change, but part of a chorus that stretched across continents, fueled by the belief that the world could be better, kinder, and more just. And with that, Elena felt a peace she hadn't known before. The future was in capable hands, and the journey she had started would continue long after she was gone, carried by those who believed in the unyielding power of speaking up. The energy in the summit hall was electric. Delegates from every continent, many of them in their 20s or younger, exchanged ideas and hopes for the future. Elena watched from the sidelines, observing the enthusiasm of young leaders ready to reshape their communities and, ultimately, the world. Zoe, now an accomplished speaker and leader in her own right, moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone who had found her calling. Amina Kundi, who had become a mentor to many through her work in grassroots education, approached Elena with a warm smile. "Look at this place," she said, gesturing to the bustling hall. "They're taking what we started and running with it." Elena nodded, eyes scanning the room filled with diverse faces full of potential. "It's exactly what we hoped for," she replied, and more. The opening ceremony was a blend of traditional dances, songs, and speeches from young activists who shared stories of triumphs and challenges. When it was Zoe's turn to speak, she recounted the first time she had met Elena and how that encounter had changed the course of her life. "It was in that moment I learned that standing up isn't just about courage. It's about believing that you have the power to change the world," Zoe said. "And today, we are here to prove that belief right." The hall erupted in cheers, and Elena felt a surge of pride. The legacy she had envisioned was becoming real, nurtured by a generation ready to push boundaries and defy the odds. The summit workshops focused on practical strategies for effecting change, building coalitions, using social media as a tool for advocacy, and navigating legal systems to push for policy changes. Zoe led a workshop titled Amplifying the Unheard, where she taught attendees how to reach out to marginalized communities and create platforms for their stories. Maria, the seamstress from Argentina who had inspired her own community, sent a video message that was played on the main screen. In it, she spoke of how she and her co-workers had gained confidence from watching others take a stand. "Seeing your stories inspired us to believe in ourselves," Maria said in the video. "We learned that courage is contagious." Dr. Lee Win ran a panel on the balance between cultural respect and universal rights, stressing the importance of understanding and dialogue. "Activism isn't just about being loud, it's about being wise," he said. "It's knowing when to push and when to listen." As the days went on, the summit produced a manifesto compiled from ideas submitted by the participants. This document, Voices for Tomorrow, outlined key objectives and strategies that could be adapted to different regions, solidifying the attendees' collective commitment to action. On the final evening of the summit, Elena found herself walking through the city streets, reflecting on everything that had brought her to this moment. Geneva's old buildings, with their blend of history and modernity, seemed to mirror her own journey, from an unexpected confrontation on a plane to standing at the epicenter of a global movement. Sam joined her, hands tucked into his coat pockets. "Penny for your thoughts?" he asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Elena smiled, taking in the peacefulness of the evening. "I'm thinking about how far we've come. There were moments when I didn't think we'd make it, when the resistance felt insurmountable. But you kept going," Sam said, his voice soft. "And look what that's done. You didn't just build a movement, you built a legacy." They stood at the edge of the lake, the water reflecting the city's lights in rippling patterns. Elena felt a wave of gratitude wash over her, not just for the work, but for the people who had stood by her side through it all. The fight was never truly over, but she no longer faced it alone. The final day of the summit was marked by a ceremony where new youth leaders were recognized for their work. Zoe stood at the podium, calling out names as young activists stepped forward to receive awards. Among them were Rafiq, who had pioneered peace talks in his community in the Middle East, and Lena, a student from Eastern Europe who had led a campaign to integrate anti-discrimination education into her country's curriculum. Elena was invited to the stage for closing remarks. As she stood under the bright lights, looking out at hundreds of inspired young faces, she felt a familiar surge of determination. "We began this journey to challenge silence, to confront discrimination, and to ensure that no one feels unseen or unheard," she said. "But today, I see a future where the echoes of courage will not fade. They will grow louder, multiplied by each of you standing here. You are the leaders now. You are the voice that will guide the world forward." The applause was deafening, a symphony of affirmation that resonated in her chest. As she stepped back, Zoe joined her, embracing her tightly. "We'll take it from here," Zoe whispered. Elena nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. The weight of leadership had shifted, but the movement was stronger than ever, rooted in the collective will of thousands ready to lead. As she looked out at the gathering one last time, she knew that the world had changed, and it would continue to change. Carried forward by those who believed that courage, unity, and justice were worth fighting for. The journey wasn't ending. It was evolving, carried by a new generation whose voices would shape the future. And as long as those voices continued to rise, the world would never fall silent again.